It's Thursday, October 5th, 2023. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm on the campus of Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas, with Dr. Ronald Keith Gaddie. Professor Gaddie is the inaugural Hoffman Chair of the American Ideal in the Adran College of Liberal Arts at TCU. Dr. Gaddie earned his AA and BS from Florida State University and his MA and PhD from the University of Georgia, where he studied at the knee of the one and only Charles S. Bullock III. A native of Kentucky, he has previously held faculty appointments at Tulane University, the University of Oklahoma, and Centre College. He has authored, co-authored, and edited several books, including Democracy's Meaning, How the Public Understands Democracy and Why It Matters, the U.S. Supreme Court's Democratic Spaces, Politics in America, The Three Governors Controversy, Skullduggery, Machinations, and the Decline of Georgia's Progressive Politics, Georgia Politics in a State of Change, The Triumph of Voting Rights in the South, and The Rise and Fall of the Voting Rights Act. The latter two were, of course, winners of the V.O. Key Award for the best book in Southern politics. And because he doesn't have enough irons in the fire, Dr. Gaddie has served as general editor of the Social Science Quarterly since 2010. I could go on and on, but I think I'll leave it there. So, Keith, thank you so much for your hospitality here in Fort Worth and taking some time out to sit for this oral history. I'm really looking forward to it.
Ash, it's a pleasure. Welcome to Texas.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's good to be with another Bulldog, another double dog who did it right with the MA and the PhD. So usually I start at the beginning with childhood and upbringing, but we're sort of once again in unprecedented time in American politics. We have a vacant speakership, which is held by a caretaker, a speaker pro tem in Patrick McHenry. Why do you think this happened, that for the first time in history, a Speaker of the House has been forced to vacate the chair?
Well, this speaker had an incredibly narrow majority, one of the narrowest majorities ever enjoyed by a speaker. He fought through multiple ballots just to get the chair. Everybody forgets that for some reason in this
15.
conversation lately. Yeah, and we were wondering if he was ever going to get there. And the problem actually goes to other things we'll end up talking about today, which is really for about 30 years, and it's kind of ironic that we're sitting here in Jim Wright's old congressional district, that really ever since Newt Gingrich effectively ousted Jim Wright from the speakership in a controversy over Jim Wright's sales of his book, a seemingly modest scandal at this point in time, that we have gone through a whole series of disrupted and displaced Republican leaders of various sorts, including Mr. Gingrich, who, as we well know, is a relocated Pennsylvanian who represented Georgia. But it's he started a process of candidate recruitment and change in the political narrative that recast the Republican Party and led it to a sustained era of effective majority control of the U.S. House for more or less the last 30 years, except for minor interruptions when the Democrats have taken hold. And every time the Republicans seek to recast their base and they move their rhetoric to recruit a new group of disaffected voters on the right, they think they're going to be able to control those groups and those voters, and those people get into elective office, and they want to actually exercise some authority. They don't want to be controlled. They don't want to be manipulated. And we're seeing the end point of that, where the most radical component of the Republican caucus was just big enough to disrupt the speaker and was willing to pull the trigger on attempting to vacate the chair. And the Democrats have been waiting for years for the opportunity to do this, and they all, as one, followed the leader, followed Hakeem Jeffries, and voted to oust the speaker, in part because the Republicans found themselves with a vulnerable majority that's ideologically fragmented, extreme, and actually fairly illiberal, to be honest, fairly illiberal, but which also articulates some real concerns that Americans have in politics that we need to give notice to and pay attention to, because they're not conservative issues, they're not liberal issues, they are really just issues of the ability to provide and live.
Is there a political universe where the Democrats, at the direction of Hakeem Jeffries, would have thrown Kevin McCarthy a lifeline, or is that just fodder for sort of the inside the Beltway talking heads?
I think that's talking head fodder, and we're in a very highly polarized environment where you've got ideologically well-defined political parties. The right and the left have never been so clearly defined in the last 150 years, and so nearly evenly balanced in terms of numbers in elections, and so geographically heterogeneous. Liberals and conservatives are everywhere, right? McCarthy just proved to be untrustworthy. It's as simple as that. And the one
to
thing,
Republicans and Democrats.
Republicans and Democrats, and the Democrats had no guarantee that if they had thrown him a lifeline or kept him afloat, that he was going to keep any promise he might make. It's sort of like the old story about the scorpion riding on the back of a fox going across a river, right? And halfway over, the scorpion stings the fox, and the fox says, "Why'd you do that?" As he drowned, and the scorpion says, "I couldn't help myself." And that's the problem: is you can't trust the scorpion. Republicans have had leadership the Democrats could trust. Democrats have had leadership the Republicans could trust. But right now, that kind of leadership isn't coming to the fore. The irony is that the acting Speaker pro tem, Representative McHenry of North Carolina, actually has a good reputation as a bargainer and as someone whose word you can trust. That because he negotiated the most recent continuing resolution, and he has a reputation for following through. And it makes her, I don't know if he's planning on standing as a Speaker candidate this early date. We know that the flawed Jim Jordan evidently is, and there are others who are looking into standing for the speakership. But yeah, I imagine we're looking at several rounds of balloting again, precisely because nobody's going to reward that radical wing within the GOP.
And the caucus numbers are the same. This isn't a new Congress. It's
No.
the same. It's the same folks.
Right, and
What are the chances of sort of a cross-party alliance where you see it in Alaska? Sometimes they're in state legislatures.
Yeah.
Again, that seems like sort of West Wing thinking.
Yeah, well, the West Wing is a fine TV show, right? And if we had a platonic republic, maybe it would work that way because that's what the West Wing was. It was Plato's Republic as television, set in the 21st century. Okay, there are historic precedents, and I'll give an example that might help. Is back in the 1980s in Florida, the state Senate went to elect a Senate president pro tem, and Florida used to always have this tradition of rotation of leadership, which is you'd have a speaker designate, a pro tem designate. So you always knew 4 years out who leadership would be. And there was this riff inside the Democratic Party caucus, and the Republicans constitute roughly a third of the state Senate at that point. Okay. So a minority of the Democrats in the Senate got together with the Republicans, put together a bipartisan coalition to elevate John Vogt, V-O-G-T, to be pro tem of the Senate. And the Republicans got 9 of 16 committee chairmanships as part of the deal. Appropriations, budget stayed with the Democrats, but still they got some plums. And but this was in the 1980s. It was back when you could do this kind of thing.
Right.
And Dempsey Barron, the old leader of the Pork Chop Gang, was still in the Senate at that point. Dempsey was one of these guys, goes back to the old Florida malapportionment days.
Right.
He'd been president pro tem in the 1950s. And, so there's precedent there. Up in Oklahoma, we had an even tie where we had a power sharing agreement that was entered into in the state Senate in 2007. And so
that was after this was Texas. Wait a minute, I'm thinking of all the Texas legislators who fled to Oklahoma.
This was just 3 years after that. And I was involved in that mess. So if we want a coda, we can talk about that. Sure. But it's this was about that time though. And so we had a Democratic governor who had gotten elected 67% of the vote in Oklahoma. Imagine that.
Is that Brad Henry?
Brad Henry, the irascible and likable Brad Henry. And then we had the Republicans had a solid 55-45 majority in the state house, and it was split in the Senate, so you had completely divided government. And the Senate was set up in a manner so that you had these veto points and blackballs that committee co-chairs could use. They'd pass a gavel back and forth from day to day in terms of who would preside for the day. And everybody had certain bills that they were guaranteed to have it. So many bills they could guarantee would advance out of committee. And they actually came up with a good budget. And the governance went well. I knew the lawmakers who were involved in negotiating the power sharing arrangement, and it actually worked because it had to.
Well, that's, and that's true at the state level, especially where you're constitutionally obligated to pass a budget, to pass a balanced budget, in the case of Georgia. But at the federal level, it's been government by continuing resolution for almost 2 decades.
Yeah, it's funny. I was up at the Oklahoma Capitol yesterday because they had a fight breaking out between the governor and the legislature because the governor wants to cut taxes. And imagine, I love the idea of getting rid of income taxes at the state level. There's not even one here in Texas. But you have to figure out how to pay for what you're going to have. And the governor and I thought this through. And pro tem up there, Greg Treat, is an old student of mine. And so I just wandered up there to hang out a bit day before yesterday. I was talking to a reporter. And we got talking about this federal issue and federal representation. And I said, here's the thing. We've got a great constitution if there were no electricity. If we lived in a time where there was no electricity, we have the perfect constitution for it, let me tell you. Because everything's going to move slow, right? Including information. The world just doesn't run that way anymore.
Right.
Yeah. But, it is funny, though, you look across not just the South, but the nation. From state to state, states that you think would behave similarly are behaving differently in terms of how their partisanship's manifesting. You look at Georgia. Georgia's actually had some really good rational politics for a couple of decades, ever since the disruption of the gerrymander in 2002 and its overturn in 2004 and the transition to Republican rule. It's actually worked pretty well. And part of my theory is that because Georgia didn't institute term limits, you're able
like
to...
Missouri, for example.
Yeah. Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana. What happens, you allow for a continuity and longevity, people know what they're doing. But
that
also,
was my GRE essay, for example.
Yeah, so exactly. And so, so you get a guy like Bob Hanner, right?
Okay.
From down where he's from down there below Stewart County somewhere. He goes from being a rural Democrat to a rural Republican in about 3.5 minutes. But his voting behavior doesn't change, right? And his constituents are still getting the same representation. They always got him the same constituency service. And he's bringing 20 years of veteran experience as a lawmaker. And
it's like Jack Reed in Georgia. He was the appropriations chair in the Senate for the Democratic Party. Switched over, brought 2 state senators with him, flipped the state Senate. State appropriations chair until he passed away suddenly, very sadly, in 2020.
Yeah.
I think culturally speaking, and we can talk about this, later on, but about what it actually meant and how the transitions happened. Yeah. But looking back at turning it back to the House, what's it going to take for whoever succeeds Kevin McCarthy in a full-time capacity to be successful or to be more successful? Or is this just wait out the clock, get a new Congress?
I think it's wait out the clock, get a new Congress, and that's part of it. And the related piece of that is, with the litigation in Alabama redrawing their congressional map.
And the fallout, there's discussions in Georgia.
It will happen in North Carolina, it will happen in Georgia, it will happen in Florida, it will happen in Louisiana, right? So you've probably got 8 Republican seats that are now on the chopping block that'll end up as minority access seats, right? Given the relative incentive, there's not a lot of room for GOP growth right now under the existing maps. I mean, there's not much way.
And New York will redraw its map now that there's a liberal Supreme Court.
Yes, what's going to happen is you could have a Democratic House in 25, irrespective of who wins the White House.
Yeah.
And that means you'll have Hakeem Jeffries as presiding officer. I assume Nancy Pelosi will get back her emeritus office at that point, and and we'll see where it goes from there. And the funny thing is, if it's a Republican in the White House, and by Republican I mean not Mr. Trump, you could actually see a midterm wave push the Democrats even further. If they are the out party but already in the majority.
Right.
The laws of mediocrity say they should gain. So,
well, let's turn it back to you, to Keith Gaddie. Tell me about your childhood upbringing in Kentucky.
Oh Lord, a perfectly conventional rural upbringing in the 1960s and 70s in rural Kentucky. I grew up 23 miles outside of Louisville, Kentucky, on the Shelby County, Jefferson County line.
Okay.
Our farm was right off of I-64, right there. My dad is a retired union master plumber, and he had made his way into the C-suite and been with the firm. And he still actually consults in his 80s, doing job bids. Oh yeah, it's that and tinkering with the old cars in the garage. We'll come back to that. Yeah. But then, and my mom, my mother, my grandmother, my dad's mama, my mamaw. Everybody's got a mamaw, right?
That's right.
My mamaw always referred to my mother as her modern daughter-in-law in the 1960s. So you can fill a lot in there. My mother was a feminist. She went to college. Bit by bit, she got her bachelor's degree after I got my doctorate.
Okay.
Yeah, and then she got a master's degree in business. She had stayed home for a while when I was young, and then she had gone back to work, and she ended up being they called it executive secretary at the time to a major land developer in Louisville, J.D. Nichols. And my parents both came from large rural families. My dad's family was very active in the Democratic Party. My mamaw, Gladys Carruthers Gaddie, she had come from a family that had fallen. They lost everything in 29. Okay. And they hung on to the small house and part of the farm, but lost most of it in the stock crash. And so by the time she married my grandfather in 1935, and by 1943, when the war had fully come around, they had 4 children. They ended up having 5 in total. My dad's the middle of those. And they had a contract, a Star Route contract delivering the mail on 2 rural routes, and covering parts of Shelby, Spencer, and Jefferson County right there. And this is all around the area where my family had settled in the 1770s, and we've been there forever. And so sometimes in the summer, if my mom had to do something, we lived on the mail route. My grandmother drove this old 1953 Chevy step-side pickup with one of the 5-window jobs. Yeah, and it was just round and curvy and retros all get out. And we knew what time she'd come by, and so right after lunch, she'd say, "Okay, you just go out there and stand by the mailbox, and your mamaw's going to come by, and you hop in the truck and have her honk, so I know. And I'll come pick you up after supper up at her house." And so I'd ride the mail route with her, and she had these old boxes full of mail, and I'd help her sort the mail that came in, and people would just leave money in a little mason jar lid for stamps, so we wouldn't have to go to the post office. The post office was on the ground floor of a building built in the mid-19th century that housed a Masonic lodge, also, in this little burg called Fisherville, which at one point had been a hot spring. And then the hot spring dried up, the mineral spring dried up, but it had hotels and probably illegal gambling and God knows what else. But I'd ride with her, and this was during the Watergate summers. So this is 72, 73, 74. I'm 6, 7, 8 years old. And so I'd talk politics with her. Oh my God, that woman hated Richard Nixon. Oh, she hated Richard Nixon. And did you ever see the movie Mrs. Doubtfire?
Oh, yeah.
She looked just like Robin Williams dressed up as Mrs. Doubtfire.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
If I showed you a picture of my mama, that's exactly what she looked like. And she liked that I liked history. And as I got into high school, I'd stop in periodically, a couple of days a week at least, and visit with her. And after she'd retired from running the mail route, and we'd talk politics. By then, she really hated Ronald Reagan. Oh God, she hated Ronald Reagan. But she and my grandfather were both part of the Happy Chandler machine in Kentucky, and
Okay.
they used to do voter turnout,
A.B.
mobilization.
Happy Chandler.
Yeah, A.B. Happy Chandler for second commissioner of baseball, right?
That's right.
And then he got fired for integrating the sport. He actually decided to act like a commissioner, and they got upset with
Yeah,
him.
they thought they were getting another Kennesaw Mountain Landis.
Well, exactly, who certainly looked good, right? Yeah, but so, you go through all this. But, and then my dad's dad, he was a mechanic, and small man. Actually, there's a picture of him around here somewhere in the office, I think. Well, yeah. Oh, yeah, it's back there. It's right behind me there.
Yeah, I see it.
It's him in the Navy back in '44. But when he came back from the war, that's why I bring this up, they had that contract together.
Right.
They get back from the war, my grandmother, this is in, probably around November of '45, she looks and goes, Johnny, I'm very glad you're home, but you're going to need to find something else to do because I like to get out of the house and get away from all these children. So he went off and became a mechanic for the county garage, and he had a county truck. And he'd always fill, and the county truck, he just filled up with gas every day. And he'd fill it up with gas, and in the 50s, he'd come home, and he has 4 teenagers at home, right?
Oof.
And they'd all siphon gas out of his truck to fill up their cars, okay? And so, so Johnny, he'd run out of gas going back to the garage sometimes. And they fueled my grandmother's truck to drive the postal route, everything. But it was delightful because it was just a big, spirited, over-the-top family. And all those children succeeded, and they all had children who succeeded. But I was the first male in my family to go to college since before the Civil War. It's just, it just had ceased to be a thing for the longest time. My grandmother's family was where the college goers had been, and
Right.
they lost everything in the war. They were really good at losing the farm over and over again. It's a particular talent. But yeah, so high school in the '80s, got into working on cars with my dad and my uncles, who were all mechanics also. Restored a '66 Mustang when I was 15. That was great fun. I've still got a '64 and a half convertible that my dad and I did.
Okay.
So it's
Okay.
up at the house in Norman. There's a model of it right up there.
Okay.
But
yeah.
we
Same color?
is that the red one up there?
No, this is
no,
blue,
it is
teal.
it is a proper Georgia red
There we go.
with a black
There we go.
interior.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotta do it right.
Yeah, and it's even got the elongated G floor mats. So it's
There you
it's
go.
a proper
Power G.
It's a proper Mustang, But we it's I'm a little bit autistic, and they didn't know what that was back then. And
Right.
so so you learn to manage, right? But the thing is, I knew that if I got interested in a thing,
Right.
I wouldn't stop until I knew everything about it. And so I went to college, and I thought the beer was food.
What's cold barley soup?
Yeah, and it's funny because what happened is I knew there was a slot for me in the union if I'd wanted to be a plumber.
Okay.
And I mean, I could have done that, could have gone into business, probably done quite well. But that's not what I wanted to do. I didn't want to work with the tools necessarily. But I always loved to write.
Okay.
And always had a thing for history in particular. And I'm just going to kind of jump ahead, Ben, if I'm rambling too much, bear with me. When I was at Florida State, though, I had three professors who really impacted me. One was political scientist named Glenn Parker.
Right.
And Glenn was a Congress scholar. He introduced me to the work of Richard Fenno, who used to go out and do field observation and interviews, and he called it soaking and poking. But Dick, it was ethnography. And I fell in love with Dick's work. I actually even got to do some of that in one of my books, Born to Run. It was 5 years of field work like that. But the other two were historians. And one was a guy named John Hebron Moore, who had gone to Mississippi State. He'd grown up on a plantation in Mississippi down near Natchez. He was just this little frog of a man. He had 2 suits and 2 ties that he'd rotate between.
I know the type.
He had done his he had started his PhD before World War II, then came back after the war, went to Emory and finished his doctorate. And he had been department chair at Ole Miss at one point. He was at FSU. And he wrote about antebellum Southern economic history. I thought it was fascinating stuff. The man never brought a note to class to lecture. He never wrote a thing on the board. The only thing he ever put on the board is he drew a perfect dog run cabin. But I still had this many notes from his classes. And then there was a guy named James Pickett Jones, James P. Jones, who was department chair at FSU forever. And I actually tried to get Jim to apply for the Russell chair. And this is when Jim Cobb got hired, which was the perfect hire for that chair. But had I known Jim was going to be a candidate for it, I would have said, man, it's good by me. But Jim Jones, he had written a book on the Illinois Republican Party in the 1850s. And then he had done a book on Sherman's March. And I had him for postbellum presidential politics, and then also for American Civil War. And he was just amazing, amazing scholar, great lecturer. Chairman of the athletics committee at FSU, faculty athletics committee. He wrote a couple of books on FSU football.
It's a good time to be the chair of that committee.
Oh, God, yeah. He had chaired that committee when they hired Bobby Bowden.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, he'd been at this
He'd
stuff.
been there.
But as he put it, he said, you know, of all the Confederate generals that my family could have given me a middle name from, they picked the worst one, Pickett. But I went to Jim because I wanted to go to grad school. I mean, this is a great gig, you know.
Sure.
They pay us to read and write interesting books and to talk to people about them. What a great gig. And the world is new every September, right? But I went to Jim and I said, hey, I want to go to grad school. I want to do history. He goes, Gaddie, there are no jobs in history. However, I hear that you are somewhat good with mathematics. Perhaps you should do a political science PhD. It's almost as good.
That's good advice.
It is. And so I went and talked to Glenn Parker. And Glenn said, you know, Keith, if you hadn't screwed around so much when you were fresh and drinking so much, your grades would be a lot higher. And he said, these GREs and seeing your work, said, you ought to be going to Yale, but we can't get you in there. He said, here's what you do. You go to UGA. We'll get you into UGA. And you go to UGA and you go work with Chuck Bullock and you just do whatever the hell he says. Don't question it. Just do it. And Ash, I'm going to tell you, I am 57 years old. I've been following that advice for 36 years. And it has never steered me wrong.
That's right.
So that's my prolonged youth.
Yeah.
But that's the story of it is there were two things I was always afraid of as a kid because I also have a stutter. And it doesn't show anymore. But the two things I hated doing was speaking in public and having people read what I write.
Well,
the thing I learned in my 20s, though, is it's easy to do the things you're good at. Mm-hmm. Doing the things you're not good at, that's harder, but that's real satisfying. And you should lean into these things. So charging at your fears mattered. So I like, if you want me to do something, tell me I'm not capable of doing it, and I will go out and do it well. And that's just, that's something that I like to draw out in my students. It's something that I want for my own children. I was always driven, and I don't want them to be driven. I want them to be content. I want them to have a better life in that manner. And, as I told Kim the other day, I said, part of me is always a little bit discontented. But don't take that personally. Don't just take that personally. That's just how I am.
Right.
If I'm not a little bit discontented, I don't know what to do with myself. I'm always going to be disappointed in something. But, I'm not going to be disappointed in my children or in, her. It's just going to be myself.
Right.
But, what the hell? It's
that's sort of what fuels you to keep going and to take on the new project and finish that project and keep rolling, which is something you've done throughout your career.
I appreciate that.
So tell me, what was Athens and the University of Georgia like when you moved north from Tallahassee?
It was just before UGA became really good because it was before Hope.
Right.
Yeah. And so when I got to Athens, it was 1987.
Okay.
And so this is right after REM was really kind of hit and exploded, and End of the World had just come out, right?
Okay.
And when I was doing AM talk radio, that was my bumper music. It just seemed that may be the greatest rock song ever.
Oh, wow.
In my opinion, it's amazing.
Putting out his marker.
In 5 minutes, I think they had 676 words uttered or something like that. I mean, Billy Joel's kind of a piker, and we didn't start the fire compared to that song. But it was, this was downtown was a little more grungy.
Yeah.
The junkman's daughter hadn't become bougie yet. Don't tell him I said that. Varsity had just moved off the square. There was a Chinese place there, as I recall, at that point.
It is now a Chick-fil-A.
Oh God, that's terrible. Yeah, that's terrible to hear. The grill was actually around the corner on Broad still.
Okay.
Over at the 5 Points, there were two little deck bars. There was Steve Reno's and Sons of Italy, and that's where the Subway and I think there's an Indian place there now, or a shawarma place, something like that. But Athens had this kind of gritty feel to it. You had a goth scene that was kind of coming up, but also it was a strong country scene there at that point in time. John Barry was about to break out in country music, and these are the last days of Vince Dooley and Tailback U, right? And I got close to that because one of the guys my dad played high school FFA ball with was a guy named Hugh Durham, who coached the Dogs for years in basketball. Okay, Hugh had coached FSU to the Final Four. He came to UGA. He coached UGA to the Final Four in 1990.
Okay.
And he got let go a few years later. And then Durham, I guess this was after Garrison Hurst had finished his run after Herschel, and the defense was still killer. Irk Russell had just left to go to Georgia Southern. And there was a lot of contemplation and discussion about what does the succession look after Dooley, right? And of course, this is Larry Munson in his heyday, right? Mm-hmm. And so you'd be listening to Larry on sports talk radio, and callers would call. I still remember this clear as well. This caller calls in. The nature of the humor of the time. Dooley had just had an angioplasty done on his heart. And some caller comes in before they can hit the mute button and says, "Larry, was that a balloon they stuck in Dooley's heart valve, or was that a condom? Do you know?" So this was the nature of the humor. This is on WGAU.
Uh-huh.
Okay. So, but it was, roaring Greek life, but the racism on campus was still somewhat evident in the student body. And it wasn't like an overt thing, but Kappa Alpha was still doing Old South with uniforms and everything. And I still remember seeing this T-shirt on this one white kid once. And remember the old Cotton logo? Mm-hmm. Had the Cotton logo on the bottom. It said, "Cotton, we grew it, you picked it, get over it." Yeah, that makes me feel real welcome as a black kid on campus, let me tell you, right?
I imagine the black student population was very low.
It was very low. And you had at UJ a problem that still persists on a lot of major campuses, which is the assumption among the white student body that every black student there is either there on affirmative action or as an athlete. Neither of which is typically the case, but the assumption was there. But, I mean, UJ was trying. It was trying. Because I was in grad school, most of my time at UJ was really shaped by really two things, which was my work at the athletic department and my work on my doctorate. Okay. The research work, teaching in political science, working with Chuck Bullock, building a lifetime relationship with him, and him folding me into his consulting work, which would come back and shape a big chunk of my life and actually propel my career in a manner I'd never expected. Athletics, I was there when Dooley retired and Ray Goff took over. Mm-hmm. That was a surprise. The name is eluding me right now, but there was a defensive coordinator everybody thought was going to elevate to become the new head coach. And he ended up at East Carolina and later on at Georgia Tech. You know who I'm talking about. Yeah. And they ended up reaching down for Ray Goff, who was the associate head coach and I think also coordinated the videotapes or something like that. But Ray had this incredible donor support and alumni support because Ray had run the Veer offense in the 1970s when the Junkyard Dogs were having that killer defense, right?
Right.
And of course, the guy that ran tutoring, who I also worked with, he had been one of the Junkyard Dogs. I mean, you got this defense that's made of a bunch of cast aside receivers and quarterbacks and a couple other just mediocrities. And Irk Russell carves a defense out of these guys that dominates the SEC mid-decade. So the swivel-hipped Ray Goff has become our head coach because that's who the donors wanted. And then we discover that, well, we can't have events at Ray's big new house because his wife, who was a cheerleader in South Carolina, will not allow liquor in the house. So we're having to do donor events over at Vince and Barb's house still, right? But so I worked as a grad assistant there for 2 years. First year I was in residence. A guy who just died named Ernie Hammond. He was from St. Simons, and Ernie just knew everybody. He was a Vietnam vet. He gets me folded in, so it's three of us, 3 doctoral students living in an apartment at the back of the old McWhorter Hall before they tore it down. Mm-hmm. This was a men's-only dorm. And so the 3 of us are running the football dorm.
Bill Lewis,
yes.
Bill Lewis.
Bill Lewis was the DEC in question. And honestly, if Bill Lewis had been hired as head coach at UGA, Georgia football history takes a very different path, but I'm not sure it arrives at the greatness that it has right now in the 2020s. It's a shame, it's a shame it took so long.
Right.
But, it's okay, 2 titles in my 50s.
We're here now.
I'm good for a couple of decades at least, right? But Bill Lewis, everybody was shocked when it wasn't Bill Lewis because it made sense.
Sort of like when Arkansas didn't hire Jimmy Johnson and hired little guy. Oh my gosh, his name escapes me at the moment. Coach Notre Dame, Minnesota, South Carolina.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. We can edit this part out if you want to. No.
Neither here nor there.
No. You're talking about Lou Holtz.
Lou Holtz.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Lou Holtz and Steve Spurrier are proof that nobody can win a championship at South Carolina. Okay. If these 2 guys can't do it, no one can. I mean, it's what's the old line? God can't hit a 1-iron. Mm-hmm. Yet God also can't give the Gamecocks a national title. That ain't gonna happen. No, but anyhow, so so I spent a year as a grad assistant, and I'm reporting to Joe Tereshinsky,
okay,
the assistant strength and conditioning coach. Joe had been golf center on with the Junkyard Dogs.
His son, the best position on the offensive line.
His son, Joe T. the Third. Well, his dad had been an incredible tight end for the Dogs back in the 40s. His son, Joe T. the Third, is the backup quarterback, number 13, who had to come in and QB the Dogs against the Gators at the last minute, and almost won the game anyway. He could have gone to Harvard and done just fine, but he came to UGA to play. And was never, he was supposed to have one function, which was to hold for PATs, right? That was what he was there to do. And wear that unfortunate number 13. But, so I was reporting to Joe T. and did that for a year, and then moved over into tutoring for a year and was tutoring I wasn't teaching American government, so I could tutor American government.
Okay.
So I tutored for a year in athletics over there in McWhorter,
and this would have been right after the big the academic scandal.
This was after the Jan Kemp scandal, and so we're taking it seriously, and we're not taking any Prop 48s. We're not taking any questionable players, which has often been
Prop 48s where you could admit the student, they would sit, get the grades up, then play.
Yeah, but they were basically getting no college credit that first year, and so Dooley wouldn't recruit them. We couldn't recruit them, and it was interesting watching the efforts to reshape the culture of tutoring, which they succeeded at. But the one of my players the year I was living in was Bill Goldberg.
As somebody who grew up watching, the golden age of the NWO invasion of WCW, that name sticks out. It's a core memory.
I'll hand this to you in a minute. But the thing about that first year in athletic, we won the SEC. We went to the Final Four. But no, they didn't go to the final. They won the SEC. But also, the Dogs won the College World Series.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so that's something you won't find very many of. It's faded over the years.
Yeah, oh, sure.
That is an autograph ball for UGA's College World Series champions in 1990.
National champs.
Yeah, they beat the Oklahoma State Cowboys.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So and none of those guys amounted to anything in baseball. But it was a great team because it was an improbable team. They were unranked, and Georgia Tech was number 1 in the nation.
Right.
And they swept Georgia Tech in back-to-back 4-game series in Atlanta and Athens. And that's what propelled the Dogs into the NCAAs and ultimately to the national championship. Yeah. Oh, I just don't have my glasses on. But yeah, it's
hard throw there.
you know, so the things in my life, I never expected to get close to athletics. Really,
Right.
I mean, I'd always been a distance runner. Loved running. Enjoyed the weight room, but I was never really. You know how many 5'11" kids in Kentucky want to play shooting guard for University of Kentucky?
Probably a lot.
All of them. Yes, all of them. And so, I knew I was never going to make it in that space. So, I like to play, but, it just wasn't an aspiration. Right. And yet, in my career, I've kept orbiting back into athletics. I've written about it. I've consulted on it. I can't go into it, but I worked OU's move to the Southeastern Conference, and someday when I give my papers to UJ, the papers for all that will be in there. I've been a consultant to the Big Ten on conference realignment. I'm still a consultant to a couple of other athletics programs right now on athletic strategy.
We're in a period, we could do an entire interview on how college athletics has changed in the last 10 years,
well,
5 years.
We got a couple of days if you want to sit down and do another tape. It should be my pleasure to do it.
We live in interesting times politically. College athletics. We're entering a new period of sort of Premier League. Super conferences.
Well, and it's sort of funny, socially, culturally, politically, we are beating the 20th century to death, finally, and we're losing the best of it and the worst of it. And that's actually, I was sitting here making notes. I'm working on a Carnegie grant proposal. TCU wants to nominate me for a Carnegie, and it's on polarization. I've been thinking this through, and I think a big problem of coming to terms with polarization is that we keep taking that term, which is a very specific thing, we keep shoving other stuff into it. And the other problem is we've got this really bad baseline for understanding who we are as a people in our politics, which is that we like to look at the bright and shinies of the post-World War II era in a vague and sepia-toned manner looking back, and ignore all the bad crap in that period. And yet somehow we want to say, that was the great normal.
Right.
We are so far removed from that World War II generation that my grandparents were in. It's just, we're so far removed from a world where you can just send your kid out to stand next to a mailbox, hop in a truck, and drive down the road, right? We're so far removed from having a relatively homogenized, civilized, fact-driven news that we're never going to go back.
That's essentially gate cap.
Exactly. There were 3 flavors of news, right? And it was just a question of whether or not you were going to get
Huntley Brinkley, you want
Chancellor, or you want Cronkite. Yeah, that's actually. I need you to pan and get this.
Yeah,
this image right here. This is Walter Cronkite at his first job. He was the voice of the OU Sooners. My first broadcast job was at WKY Radio in Oklahoma City behind the same microphone.
Well, there you
I will
go.
always take pride in that. I was never that good, though.
No.
But so it's, having grown up, as a kid, my dad would come home from work. He'd come downstairs into the living room. He'd sit down. He'd have the afternoon newspaper because the morning paper came too late for him to read. He would pour himself a whiskey and Coke. He would hand me a Coca-Cola. We would sit there. He'd finish a section of the paper and hand it to me, and we'd watch the CBS Evening News. My dad was not a man of letters, but he liked to be informed.
Well, I think that's, I don't know. There's something. I was talking to Seth Maskett up in Denver about something similar, which is, and it's an idealized notion, and obviously the gatekeeping and sort of undemocratic nature of our institutions.
Yeah.
That's a major issue that we're facing now, especially if you think the Senate, for example, the gerrymandered districts, the self-sorting of liberals and conservatives in rural and urban areas.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if we look back to the 1940s, 1950s, the pre-McGovern Commission, the pre-Hunt Commission of nominating with the primary elections, at the same time, you had gate-kept news,
Right.
media, newspapers. You had gate-kept political parties.
Right.
But that was seen as a positive good for a
Yeah.
while. And now that we don't have that, a lot of folks point to the nomination of Donald Trump, for example. If there was more gatekeeping, if the parties actually decided, that never would have happened.
Well, this is, James Bryce in the 19th century talked about the dangerous man versus the safe man, and the importance of the importance of institutional structures in keeping the ambitious great man at bay.
Right,
Or have safe
which
men.
consumed
Yeah.
our founding generation. The avaricious. Go back to Plato's Republic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So so we. The conversation this is the danger of the political scientist in particular, because a political scientist is a quantitative version of a historian who likes to play counterfactual. Okay, we are very dangerous. We actually think that we are Harry Seldon. We can model to the future, and that we can also hop into a time machine and go back and tweak things, right? We would do that if we could. God, political scientists would love time machines, if only to set up experiments.
You have to, because your sample sizes are always too small.
Exactly. Well, that's the one nice thing about Jim Campbell once ran a series of linear regressions with an independent variable, a dependent variable, and 3 observations. He called it triplet analysis. And lo and behold, everything either had a perfect fit or a completely imperfect fit, and nothing in between. But what he was doing was just basically a moving regression discontinuity experiment. That's all it was. No, actually, the serious side, the historian is interested in a particular war, a particular era, a particular party.
Yeah.
Political scientists are interested in wars. We're interested in the construction of eras. We're interested in parties. We are looking for generalized covering laws. You all are looking for depth of understanding. And you give us rich context. Historians give us rich context, and we give you good information.
Yes.
We give you data. And the economists and the historians love political scientists because of the data, right? I mean, we're for shit for theory, okay? We have come up with one good covering law ever, okay? One good covering law ever. But this is what we do, is we plunge into the messy stuff, and we'll grab a theory from column A and a level of analysis from column B and a source of data from column C, and then we'll grab an estimator and we'll churn something out the back end. We can't agree on anything, nor should we. We're very plural in that respect.
Well, talking about that with political science.
Yeah.
What was the department like at UGA? You had Chuck.
Yeah.
Locke would have been there.
Yeah, they were both on my master's committee.
Well, those are two great, two of the best who have ever done it.
Locke Johnson and Chuck Bullock together may have more gravitas than any two people you'll ever meet. I've only ever seen Locke Johnson lose his temper once.
To me, that's inconceivable that he would ever actually lose his temper.
He was dealing with grad students, and I won't elaborate on it, but it was absolutely reasonable that he should have lost his temper. He had been pushed beyond his last.
I'll have to ask Locke about this.
Yeah, tell him Gaddie said something about when you lost your temper in 1990.
1990. All right.
Yeah, Locke actually, I think he was born in Oklahoma. He went to Eisenhower High School.
What he was born in New Zealand.
New Zealand, that's right. Yes.
His father was a bomber with the RAF.
That's it. Yes.
And his mother married a GI or a pilot.
Yeah, but Locke went to high. He went to high school
at James Clapper.
Yeah. He went to high school at Ike in Lawton.
Yeah.
But no, Locke was tremendous. Okay, so that department back then. Let's see, Del Dunn, whose wife had worked for former secretary, right? Del was just tremendous, a very kind man, a wonderful scholar. He was department chair when I arrived. And then Tom Louth became department chair my first year.
Just passed away.
I know, it's a shame, because Tom Tom was the unexpected mentor I had in my career. When I was approached about being a department chairman, I called Tom up and talked to him about it. When I was approached about deanships, I called Tom and talked about it. I actually interviewed for the deanship at SPIA. When Tom retired, it was the iteration after Tom's retirement in 2017. I interviewed for that gig. And I did not give a good interview, as witnessed by the fact that I live in Texas. But Tom told me once, he said, Keith, when I was a department head, the faculty thought I worked for them, the dean thought I worked for him, and I knew who I worked for.
You're probably the only middle manager who ever knew who he actually worked for.
Yeah. Well, Tom worked for Tom. But Tom took care of people, and Tom always focused on the problem, had amazing patience, as would befit a budgeting scholar. I mean, Tom Louth was one of the men who actually invented
he's
budgeting.
Written the Bible on Georgia state budgeting, if you want to know how the budget works.
Yeah, and you think about it, I mean, when he started in budgeting in Georgia, it was right after Jimmy Carter had introduced zero-based budgeting to the state.
Oh,
right?
Yes.
This is the 1970s, yeah. Because, Tom was over there at Georgia State before he comes over to UGA. But, Tom was there, and then Chuck was there. He had come back from University of Houston probably about 10 years earlier and taken the Russell chair.
Story at the symposium that he only left just so he could get a raise.
Yes.
Doubled his salary just by leaving for a year.
Then he comes back, and so here's the other thing is, oh God, what's his name? The old first Russell chair.
It was.
And I don't know. I can picture him. His name went out of my head.
It was. Keep talking. I'll get to it.
Yeah. He actually died in a car crash in the early 1990s, living with his sister. Wrote an article in 1962 about the county unit system. Mm-hmm. It's the only article I'd ever seen in the Journal of Politics that indicated its public presentation had been to the Garden Club of the city of Athens, Georgia. Alsay. So you're still getting stories of all the guys who had been there in the 50s and 60s from people like Alsay and Rifle Range and people like that. Larry Beth was still there at the time. And then two really colorful people. One was a colorful, wonderful scholar who died of cancer named Suzette Talrico. Mm. And Suzette basically started the entire criminal justice program, basically from the ground up, and turned it into a monster. And sometime you ought to go and you ought to talk to Roger Hartley, who's the dean up at University of Baltimore. And because Roger was Suzette's protege, and he's had a tremendous scholarly career. And
my mom and dad both taught criminal justice for years at the community college level.
Yeah, and then and also Sally Selden, who is now the provost at Citadel, and she had been provost at Lynchburg before that. She had worked with Jeff Brudney.
A female provost at the Citadel.
And she's doing great. But Sally and I, we've been in grad school together because we worked in the Baldwin Data Analytics Center, the BDAC, up there on the second floor. Mm-hmm. Oh God, there was this old boy who was a programmer in the BDAC. I can't remember his name, but he used to shoot pool all the time. And he always he looked like he'd stepped straight out of a George Thorogood album. But
George Thorogood and the Destroyers.
But that was the thing.
Was Bob Grafstein?
Bob Grafstein was on my committee. Bob was there, and Bob. Of course, Bob had done his dissertation in Chicago with David Easton, who was one of the most. David Easton should have won a Nobel Prize. He was one of the greatest political economists of the 20th century. Died at 97. Yeah, but Bob was on my dissertation committee. And then two guys are no longer at Georgia: Brad Lockerbie and John Clark. John ended up at Western Michigan. Brad's in East Carolina. But then Ed Kello was on my committee. Ed was an assistant professor back then. And, Ed I think he just retired. I think he'd stepped aside as public administration chair. Bob Golombiewski was still around. Well, Bob Golombiewski was around, and Bob Clute.
Yeah. And
you got to talk to people about Bob Clute. Bob Clute had worked for you just had to find this shit out about Bob. Bob Clute had worked for the OSS at the end of World War II, and his wife was over there in Europe too. And Bob is undercover in Germany in 47, 48 on the east side. And Bob is this Cajun who grew up in Iowa. And he had been at Tulane on faculty at one point. And when UGA went smokeless in '87, you'd go into one of the classrooms, there'd be a sign that says, no smoking in the space. Bob would walk in, sit down, pull out a pack of cigarettes, tap, tap. Well, we won't smoke up there. But Clute, he was an IR scholar, Africanist. But his wife had coordinated running all the trains into Berlin after the Berlin blockade ended in '48. So, you had these really remarkable, wonderful, colorful scholars. And, it's funny because this was right when Bullock was just turning into a popular professor. He had really leaned into teaching the Southern politics class. And
Southern politics, legislative process.
That's all he's taught for the last 50 years. And sometimes American government. But Chuck, he's just an amazing professor. Incredible storyteller, incredible grasp of detail. And it's funny, did you ever have him for seminar?
I never had a class with him. He was on my dissertation committee.
Well, Chuck would walk in just with a pile of files. He'd pop them down.
I've seen the files.
And he'd flip it open, and he'd start talking to you about this thing, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about Georgia politics, and we're going to talk, Gaddie, what a county unit system is? Yeah, I think I do. I've malapportioned. Well, it's sort of like that, but not. And sometimes he'd just pause in the middle of talking for a couple of minutes, flip through something, and just come back with this well-aimed question that stunned us all in our tracks. But I saw something with Chuck that I'd never seen before with an undergraduate class. I was his TA in Southern politics. And actually Scott Buchanan, who's down at Georgia College now, and Chuck and Scott and I wrote a book together, and I've supervised Scott's dissertation. Scott's in there as an undergrad. Chuck had forced me into lecture sometimes because he had to go off and do a case. And but at the end of the term, we get done. The students applauded. They all shook his hand on the way out the door. 58 kids leaving the door after the last lecture before the final.
It's like the end of an Episcopal church service.
Everybody
shakes the rector's hand.
Well, Chuck is a good Episcopalian, so that makes sense. But the only other time I'd seen that in my life was at the end of the movie, that law school movie that Timothy Bottoms was in back in '72. Paper Chase. Yeah, the end of Paper Chase was like that. But he had this storytelling quality that as he's gotten older has only become better and better and better. And because Chuck Bullock understood something he taught me I've always believed in. And I gave a talk to a group of our students here at TCU about this recently, which is that, data are important. Data inform. Mm-hmm. Data tell us the lay of the land, but stories persuade. And data alone will never persuade unless you understand data. Mm-hmm. And then you'll see the story. Chuck always understood the power of the story and the importance of the narrative. And the other thing he taught me that served me well is the importance of cadence and inflection. That by slowing down a half step and then taking advantage of that little rising lilt that I get from being from the Ohio River Valley, you can keep control of a conversation and keep people's attention. When I got into expert work, he said, Keith, remember the only person you're talking to in that room is the judge. Lawyers will ask you a question, they'll try and get you to buy into their rhythm, buy into their cadence. He said, remember, you know how to keep control of a conversation. But when they ask you a question, you turn and talk to the judge. Because the judge is going to drift off in this thing. If you can keep that judge engaged, you may give your side a chance. But it'll also enhance your credibility with him. And it will frustrate the attorneys because they don't have control of you. And that is important because in political science we surrendered so much about the law that we shouldn't have to the law schools, including the understanding of the judiciary itself. And I count it as a privilege that I learned that from him. I count a privilege that Chuck saw fit to write articles with me in grad school, then write books with me as a professional, and to even follow my lead on a project or two. And that's been a treat.
Did you find it difficult at any point to go from teacher-student relationship to partner? with Dr. Bullock?
Well, this is the funny thing about Chuck Bullock is, if you were writing with him, it was collaboration. I mean, the first few papers and articles we did, I was principally there for my data skills and for my analytic skills. I knew how to get stuff out of the computers. I understood how to use the latest estimators, and that was my principal job. But what was neat was I was also working with a couple of other people, and I noticed that I started to influence the shape of my writing with Chuck. And if you look at how we've written, if you look at the stuff that he was writing when he and I started writing together, and you compare what he and I wrote together, and then you look, say, 5 years downrange, you can see my voice coming through a lot more, my style coming through a lot more. So he loves to learn, and he never had any ego about the writing. The one thing he told me, he said, words are a valuable resource, used no more than necessary. Dissertation drafts, he'd send chapters back to me and say, anytime you see the following words occurring at the beginning of the sentence, simply cut them out. However, although, on the one hand, on the other hand, but, though, thus, and, right? He said, these are great for conversation, Keith, but they impede your writing. And I am doctrinaire about that now as a professor.
Wow.
You don't need this stuff, and you don't.
It's a transition, Keith.
I know, but the thing is, you don't need it. It's a crutch, right? It's a crutch, and you're losing the opportunity. You're chewing up space that you can then put a perfectly witty, snarky footnote in somewhere else about baseball. Okay.
The political scientists do enjoy the witty footnote.
Well, it's
whereas historians, we just cram every citation. Known to man.
Yeah.
In a footnote.
I had when my publisher killed a bunch of textbooks, including mine. I did a textbook with Tom Dye for a number of years, and Dye was actually the political science chair at Georgia that hired Chuck.
Okay.
Before he went down to FSU. Well, Tom, the next edition, my plan was I had an entire short novel I'd written. I've published 2 novels, but I had this short novel I'd written for fun. I was going to infuse the entire thing with the textbook as footnotes. Because nobody reads the footnotes.
Well, not
nobody, but I'm banking on that one person that does. There must be Easter eggs in life, right? There must be these things. There has to be that clever little thing, right? This is the beauty of Leonardo and Michelangelo, and it's that.
Which there are some beautiful bronze cast sculptures in this building of Michelangelo, Madonna and Child.
And those are wax molds. Those are cast from
of the originals.
Those are from wax molds of the originals.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
They do some stuff right here at TCU. I tell you what. But
neither here nor there.
Yeah.
But
no. But it's that transition is not difficult. I'd say Chuck was always, if you're lucky in life, you're privileged to have 2 fathers, a father who loves you and another one who understands you. And I got that with Chuck. And he never had any sons. He had daughters, and they were wonderful, wonderful women, Beth and Becky. And they just let me into the family also. But we've always had a very good understanding of each other going back to when I took my first position at Tulane. But when he drugged me into the litigation stuff starting in 01, 02, there was a case that came up in Georgia, and this was Cox v. Larios, which this follows on Georgia v. Ashcroft. And what was funny is Chuck called me up when Georgia was looking for an expert to do the Ashcroft case. And Chuck calls me and says, Keith, Attorney General is looking for me to find an expert to testify. You did a hell of a job down there in Texas, and also Wisconsin. You want to do Georgia? And I said, well, Chuck, I said, those maps are awful. I said, and I've set myself up as a good government expert. And,
these are the Bobby Kahn, Roy Barnes maps.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's a Rochard test put on top of a Jackson Pollock painting. It's a remarkable map. One consists of part of Savannah and a string of islands going down through the Okefenokee Swamp until you get to Waycross. Brilliant, horrible map. Well, anyhow, he gives me a call and says, I wanted to ask you if you want to do this case. That I was asked to ask you if you want to do this case. I said, well, Chuck, what do you think? He said, well, he said, they'll pay you very well, but you'll have no standards when you get done. And I said, well, I think I better take a pass. He said, I think that's what I told him you'd say. So I took a pass. Well, anyhow, a year and a half later, Republicans are bringing a case against the state of Georgia on a one-person, one-vote standard in Cox v. Larios. And they called me up, the Republicans called me up, and they said, this challenge, he said, the lawyer was Mark Braden, who was up at Baker Hostetler up in D.C. One of his clients was Major League Baseball.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, Mark calls me up and says, Keith, we got a case. It's Georgia. He said, you know Georgia. He said, you know the maps are awful. Your testimony trail is perfect for this map. You're the perfect expert to go up against this map. And Brian Tyson was a map drawer and a law student at that point in time. He's now the principal election law lawyer in Georgia. We go in there. I called Chuck up and said, Chuck, I said, I'm taking Larios. He said, all right, good. He said, I thought you might. He said, Georgia's got me retained, but I'm going to tell him I can't work the case. I said, what? He said, no, I'm not going to work against you. And this guy, Chuck Bullock, is a warrior when it comes to anything he does. But he stepped out of a case. I think he did it for two reasons. One is he knew the maps were an abomination, and two, he didn't want to have to go to war with me.
Right.
And the counsel on that case was Dave Walbert, who represented, he was a civil rights lawyer back in the 60s, working with Lachlan McDonald and what's his name? The big criminal defense lawyer over there in Atlanta, lives up there on West Paces Ferry. We'll come back to that. But we won that case, got those maps thrown out. Mm-hmm. Because these maps, if anybody ever bothers to listen to this, those districts were designed to perpetuate a Democratic majority, which had been losing a majority of the vote for a decade.
Right.
Tom Murphy's speakership showed that it far sooner than it did. Mm-hmm. And they had maps that took 46% of the vote and turned it into 60% of the seats.
Bob Irvin should have been Speaker of the House by 1996.
Yes, exactly. And, I don't think the history of Georgia turns out that much different. But the one thing that did happen there is we brought the highest level of scrutiny to the design of legislative maps because of those series of events. But unfortunately, we also opened up the door to the idea that anything goes when you draw a map as long as you equalize population.
Right.
Yeah.
Which comes to fruition in Wisconsin, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was in Wisconsin twice, and Wisconsin was the end of my consulting career.
Why was that?
Well, I knew I wanted to get out. I had been working very hard, and I did a lot of cases. And it used to be I'd get Democrats and Republicans who would call. The Democrats quit calling. Suddenly I've only got Republican clients or defense clients, right? And I'm in Wisconsin, and Chuck and we had done Wisconsin in 2002, right. And the court was going to create a map. So I was able to go in and do that thing that I do, talk about compact shapes, keeping counties together, contiguity, minimum population deviations. Yeah, community of interest is in the eye of the beholder. But and the court drew a map akin to what I would have advocated for, right? Well, I get retained in 2010, in April of 2010, which was fine. Because, hey man, I got kids I'm going to put through college the next few years, right? Got to get ready for this thing. And they're thinking they have to go to court again, and they want to have me sewn up and available. Well, then Scott Walker actually wins the governorship. Right. The Republicans hold on to the legislature with Tea Party candidates. I suddenly find myself working for a client that wants to completely screw the other guy. And the thing is, what we do, experts like me, is we develop measures, right? We generate data. We don't make decisions. We don't draw maps. But we do diagnostics, right?
Okay.
We do powerful diagnostics. And downrange in litigation on this, after I'd already gotten out of the game, a plaintiff's lawyer I get along with really well said that I was like a gunsmith who had crafted a fine weapon, and I couldn't be held responsible for what someone did with it.
You're Oppenheimer.
believe me, it feels like actually when that opinion came out, I looked at Kim and I said, "I am a death destroyer of democracy." Right? It's yeah. So that's actually an apt metaphor. That's what it felt like. But I was stressed out and exhausted. I was 100 pounds overweight, and I was about to be moved into becoming a department chairman. I decided I needed to get out. And I was also getting called to do voter ID cases.
Right.
And I'd given Georgia a consultation, not to testify, but I'd given them a consultation evaluating plaintiff's testimony in the original voter ID law in the 20-aughts.
Okay.
And I said, look, there's no case here. I said they can try, but there's no case. I got called for every voter ID case in the country. I turned them all down. At this point, my democratic values are in stark conflict.
Small d.
My small d democratic values, both my commitment to representative democracy and responsiveness, but also my commitment to enlightenment democracy, are both in conflict with the Republican Party at this point. And so I walked away. I stepped away. I was withdrawing from cases and quitting. And I just, and actually, there's an interview I did with Nina Totenberg during the litigation on the Wisconsin case. Because as it got downrange, I actually filed an amicus brief. Bernie Groffman and I filed an amicus brief in Wisconsin, demonstrating how you can detect a partisan gerrymander, why Wisconsin fails the test, and why the map ought to be thrown out. So I've burned my bridge. I'm saying my old client did something wrong, and here's why.
Was that interview for her Slate podcast?
No. This was on NPR.
Oh, okay.
Yes, we did 2 interviews. We did one with the opening of the session in October of 17, and then we did another one when the decision came down in 18. And she said that I was a gunfighter who had hung up my guns. And we talked about her sister in Atlanta and
Judge Amy.
Yes, Judge Amy. Yeah. And we had a real good visit, and she treated me very well in all those stories. She endorsed my truth, and that's gratifying. Not everybody buys into it, but that's okay. Some people can never get over a thing that happened, but my feeling is I'm not happy to have worked on that Wisconsin map, but I'm very pleased with my work subsequently. I think that getting together with Bernie Groffman and articulating a standard that the court should have adopted. So obviously should have adopted it.
This was the Kennedy decision that came out the year before, I guess, he retired.
Yeah, and I'm curious to see what we learn about Justice Kennedy in the coming years. It's interesting that Justice Kavanaugh is actually pivoting left and keeping Justice Roberts with him. We've actually moved to a more aggressive posture on majority-minority districts that existed in 1991.
Right. I think I was surprised. I was maybe a little less surprised than some. But it seemed like such an outlier given the conservative tilt of this iteration of the Roberts Court.
Yeah. So, have you ever talked to Chuck about this?
No.
He and I've got a theory on this. Yeah, he started it, but I will happily don all the clothing.
What time's your call with Jocelyn?
Oh, it's at 11, but it'll take maybe 30 minutes.
Okay. Well, that'd be a good break.
And we can take a break. Yeah. And then Kim's going to come by here about 12:15.
Perfect.
Yeah. That's no, but the our theory, and someday we might. Okay. There are 2 men in my life, my dad and Chuck, who give me tremendous hope. Okay. Chuck's 81 years old. And he's working on another book, right? My dad's 84 and just bought.
Energizer Bunny.
My dad's 84 and just bought a 1998 Corvette. He calls me up and he says, "Son, I bought us something." I said, "What did you buy us, Dad?" He said, "I bought us a Corvette." So that's.
What year did you say it was?
It's a 98, so it's the second year of the second year of the bubble bumper model.
Yep.
But my uncle John Mark, who died of leukemia 2 years ago, he was a custom auto mechanic, and John did the complete rebuild on this for my aunt and uncle. So this car, I know the DNA of this car, right? It's when I turn a wrench on it, it will feel familiar to that car, right? But we were in Larios, right?
Well, we were talking about Larios.
Oh, judges.
And we were talking about the Supreme Court.
Right. Okay.
This Roberts Court.
Well, Chuck and I, we've got 2 theories about judges and redistricting cases in particular. The district court judges and the panels enjoy them because they're political and they're visual. Okay? and they're interesting. They're different. There's a story, right? But they've also got narratives. They're compelling. You've got multiple players, multiple actors. And the judges can pretty much do whatever the hell they want to at that point. What's the old joke that when Jesus Christ comes back to walk the earth, he'll come as a federal district court judge so he can have real power, right? But the other theory we've got is that the Supreme Court, now our colleague Justin Wirt is also part of this theory, that they keep the redistricting law vague and in flux because they want to keep control of the debate. That they actually don't want to have clear and unambiguous law that takes the courts out of redistricting entirely, because they know from time to time they need to be able to step in,
right,
and save democracy. And you mentioned my colleague Jocelyn Evans. Jocelyn and I made the argument in our book about the Supreme Court's architecture, and this is something we contend in our work on Georgia courthouses as well, is that courts are the original democratic institutions going back 1,000 years. That the fundamental assumption when you move away from trial by combat to trial by judge with jury, you've introduced a democratic element, that you've made the conduct of government secular, and you've made it plural. And those are two preconditions to true democracy. So the justices up there in the Temple of Karnak up there, who was it that said it was Oliver Wendell Holmes that talked about the 7 black-robed beetles in the Temple of Karnak inside the Supreme Court building. Yeah, they want to keep control of this piece of law. They don't want voting rights law to be too expansively aggressive and prescriptive, but they don't want it emasculated, right?
Once they waded into the political thicket, they know that they have to maintain access.
Yeah, and the thing is, they didn't wade in. They freaking jumped in yelling Yahoo like Brer Rabbit, okay?
At the Warren Court.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Yes, exactly. And, and that's, thankfully they did learn their lesson on campaign finance, and this is where I'm unpopular.
Okay.
The problem in campaign finance is not unlimited money.
Okay.
It's not even corporate money. It's untraceable money. When people ascribe things to the 2010 decision in
Citizens United.
In Citizens United, they're asserting the wrong case. The case that ruined it was not Citizens United. Citizens United was actually a fairly limiting decision. Okay. The problem is freespeech.org, VUS, because that's a circuit court. That's a D.C. Circuit opinion that the court affirmed without comment. So it's controlling nationally. It allows you to put untraceable money into a super PAC and take it out without tracing it. It's the black money decision. The black money decision is not in Citizens United. Okay. But Citizens United is the whipping boy because of the way it operates and because it declares that corporations are people, which we have known since 1866.
That's right.
Yeah, because no man's life, liberty, or property are safe so long as the legislature is in session. Yeah.
Those the slaughterhouse cases?
No.
It's a railroad.
Yeah, and it's a New York.
It's a railroad case.
Yeah, but yeah, this is the problem. Is the court? They stepped back from campaign finance, and they stepped back basically they stepped back too far. The position of Warren Burger was in the federal in the Buckley cases was that you shouldn't put limits on giving. But what you need to do is make sure it's completely transparent. You have to have completely visible money. He was basically making the implicit argument that every comedian has made, that you should have big patches on your suit like a NASCAR driver who your sponsorship is.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that was basically the argument. We went too far in that direction, and that's the problem. But Citizens United in and of itself, if we're going to have corporate personhood, that case is absolutely right on point.
That's right. That would make you unpopular.
It sucks. It sucks. Okay, there's somewhere in this office there's a law review article that Wirt and I wrote about this. But the occasional unpopular opinion is important because that means people will also trust the times they agree with you. The most important thing for any social scientist who gets into doing any kind of consulting work, I've consulted litigation, corporations, marketing, sports, is you show your numbers and you're straight by your numbers. You offer your interpretation, but you allow people to quiz it, right? And what you do is you make clear to your client that, and I had to do this with a recent client, is I had to make clear to them, I will give you my analysis. You don't have to use my analysis, but you won't challenge my belief in what I see. You will not attempt to persuade me to make a different argument. You can go find somebody else to do that argument. That's the key, is you have to be true to your data and honest about it. Because when I would go to court, my client was the court, ultimately. The goal is to get the judge to do the right thing. And sometimes the right thing is not what your client wants. It's a step removed from it, right? Sometimes your client is wrong. And when questioned about this, you have to say, yeah, my client is wrong. When a corporation hires you to seek out information, you have an obligation to help them find what they're looking for. I used to sign customer loyalty management systems for banks and food distribution. U.S. Food Service was a client of mine a few years back. I had a business partner who had a market research firm, and so we designed this really clever system. I took a 3% royalty off the design of the mechanism, 30 minutes of work, 3 years of income, right? You've got this obligation that they understand both the scope and the limitations of the thing and what it will and won't do. You make sure they understand when you're dealing with sampling, from time to time we'll get a bad read. We're going to draw a bad sample, and that there is a trade-off between the amount of information we gather and the cost, and they have to decide what they're comfortable with and how much uncertainty they'll accept in that space. So the same basic rules apply every time, right? And that's the power of a liberal arts, social science, and humanities background. Is we're trained to engage puzzles and problems and to use different types of information. And what's cool is when I've gotten to do the work on the outside, the Bullock drug me into willingly. The first case I worked on for him as a data gopher was actually it was two of them. One was the sole commissioner case, Hall v. Holder, and the other one was the Runoffs case, the Georgia Runoffs case back in 1991. I'll tell you what, that was fun. Here's how much.
The records are at the Russell Library.
Yeah.
That case.
Real quick, it's important to understand how much tech has changed, okay? I mean, we've got the sum of all human information right here in this cell phone, right? It's all right here. I can do anything with this phone as long as I can see.
As long as you don't, like me, leave it in your Uber and you're without it for 13 hours in Sacramento, California.
That is a sinking.
That was the longest day of my life. One of them, anyway. Yeah.
It's kind of like when Captain Kirk destroys the computer on the planet, right? No, where were we going?
We're talking about the Georgia
runoff case, which the state prevailed in, because none of the four myths of the runoff held water. Okay, runoff was not and is not discriminatory in terms of effect. Perhaps it was in terms of intent, but not in terms of effect. It's very, very frustrating when the data don't back up a perfectly attractive egalitarian narrative, right?
Yeah, we know what the intent was.
Oh yeah. But everything back then was intended this way, okay? Yes. So that's but anyhow, so when we did that case, we did something novel. My wife Kim was working at FM 102, selling radio, okay? So she had a bag phone, she had a cell phone, right? Not many people had cell phones back then. And Chuck, I knew how to run all of Chuck's programs, right? And we gathered all this. I've been over at the archive for months pulling information out of the archives on all these runoffs and coding all this data. And my job was to, on the clock, hour to hour to hour, I had a little cooler full of Diet Cokes and a bag of sandwiches. And I'd sit in the BDAC on the second floor of Baldwin Hall. And I had that bag phone there. And that phone would ring, and Chuck would be at a pay phone in the courthouse. Hey, Keith, need you to pull up this data set. He said, yeah, I got that. Okay. I will run this analysis, estimate this case. Okay, what's it say? He said, this is what I'm getting, Chuck. I've got the output here. Okay, that's good. Okay, print that off. Run over to the printer, the other end of campus, right?
Yeah.
So I've got his parking hanger in my pickup truck, so I can park behind Baldwin, right? Yeah, go get that, fax it over to this number. And we were replicating. He said, can you get that done in an hour? I said, yeah, absolutely. And so, print, 5 minutes drive to the other end of campus over to where the computing center was, where they put all the tapes on. Get that print out, small print. Go to the fax machine in the department. They had just gotten a fax machine. Run that fax over to Chuck. Run back upstairs. Call him back on the payphone that he's standing beside. Fax is on the way, Chuck. That's great. I said, what's going on? He said, well, we're going to start cross-examining their expert in 20 minutes. We need to present him with this analysis. We're going to destroy him. This guy, when Chuck Bullock and I started running together when I was in grad school, because he was a marathoner. He was a serious runner.
Oh, him and Jim Cobb were both runners.
Yeah, but I remember the first time I ran a 5K, it was in probably 90 or 91, right before I got married. And we go to line up. And I say, Chuck, where do you want to? I said, Keith, let's go to the back. I said, why? He says, we can pass more people. So
he's competitive by nature.
Well, here's the thing. I know this talk has been more about Chuck Bullock than anything.
No.
But the thing is, you don't have the last half century of politics in Georgia without him.
Yeah.
And I got to do that for a quarter century in Oklahoma. I had probably 45 lawmakers in my class. The presiding officer in the Senate and the majority floor leader in the House were both my undergrads. And I've known them the whole time. The other day I was back in Oklahoma. I walked in the door just to have lunch with somebody. I ran into the entire press corps because we were in special session and they were in special session. And so suddenly I'm doing a press availability. And I told my wife Kim about this last night. She said, you've been chasing Chuck your whole life. I said, well, I like the way he does things. I like the way he takes care with everything. And the main thing I learned from Chuck is it's less important to be quoted than to get a reporter to the story. That it doesn't matter that I get my name in print. I know who I am. But if I can get them to the source they need or the information they need, or if I can help them shape their story towards the truth that I see, right? That's more important because that is first draft to history. And and that's a service. That's a service that it's why public universities with independent faculty doing rigorous work matter. You know this, you're in the same position.
Yep.
We have our expertise, right? And from time to time, they come to us and they need our expertise. And we're sitting up here on this shelf, right? And they take us off the shelf and say, here's this man who can do 2-stage and 3-stage least squares regression and limited dependent variables, and he can explain that to a decision maker. Bring him back to us later. Yeah. So in a few minutes we need a break.
Yeah.
But we should talk about Georgia.
Yeah, we should. But I also, I want to talk about what you're going to Tulane and Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, we can try and unpack Georgia and figure out why it's the center of the political universe these days.
Well, it's
which is novel and great for people like you and me.
Are we still rolling?
No. Oh yeah, we're just
okay.
we're still
Good.
rolling. But yeah, you need to get off.
No. The reason I'm asking is because I don't want to throw this away on nothing.
Yeah.
Georgia's the center of the universe because God made a bulldog, and it was good. It was a good dog. A damn good dog.
And how many English bulldogs do you have at home?
We have 3 at home now. My daughter has 1 in Athens, and people will see. His name is Bandit. And you'll see Bandit trotting around downtown Athens. Norman's trying to be SEC. They're working on it. They'll get there eventually.
They got a few years to
build
it up.
They got about 10 months to.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, I guess it did move up.
Yeah, it did. But no, we've had 13 over the years though.
Oh wow!
Well, our first was Georgia, and she was the dame of the line. She had 6 pups. One of those pups had another 5. So we've had 12. But what we did is we've never sold a dog. We give them to friends. And they are, there's actually, there's a lifestyle magazine that featured us on the cover with our bulldogs when we were living on campus at OU. In their the college I created down there, the Res College at Headington, had red and black as its colors, red, black with a bit of white. A bulldog was our mascot. Athletic director Joe Castiglione, Joe's a good friend. I mean, Joe's probably the best AD in the United States. Joe comes to me one day. It was before the Iowa State game in 2017, actually. He goes, Keith, how in the world did you put a miniature version of the University of Georgia right across the street from my stadium? The thing is, Damon Evans had been a protege of his. Remember, Damon used to be the AD at Georgia. And Damon was one of my freshmen when I worked for athletics. Yeah.
Yeah, so, there's a name I haven't thought about in a while.
Well, I tell you, we'll just leave it on a high note. Damon's doing really good stuff at Maryland, and I'm very proud of him. I used it on the internet. No one had used it before based on an exhaustive Google search.
Oh, yeah.
Untuitive.
Untuitive.
Yeah. I'll give you an example of something that's untuitive. Any class management system is untuitive. They're designed to work against intuition as a general rule, especially if it was designed by Pearson. Yeah, I mean, it's just, these are, it's like, it doesn't make sense you do it that way, but you have to do it that way.
Right.
And how is that supposed to? The entire Concur travel system is intuitive. Okay. There's just we build these mechanisms, and you follow all the directions the way it's designed, and then it doesn't work. Because it's one thing, you've been at a university for a good long time, and you go to enough institutions, you learn if you pay attention, or if you're at one institution, you pay attention. There is an unwritten rule book, right? Every university has got that other rule book. And you figure out what it is, and part of learning that rule book is you learn who's that critical 20-year staffer on campus that has the keys to everything, and you learn how to get along with them. And they're usually really good people, right? And you figure those things out. Yeah, most of the time, yeah. So you learn little things like, okay, let me ask you, when you filed your thesis and your dissertation, you filed the hard copies, right? On the 10% cotton rag paper, right? The bond paper. And they probably hand you a paper template, right? And there was that woman over there at the grad college, you remember her, the thesis hunt, right? Who would measure this up. And if you were kind and you timed things right, you went in and you paid attention to little things and you just followed the basic rules, you get it right. And if you were cooperative in dealing with a couple of things that might have been wrong at the front end, they'd look past the rest of it, right? But if you were like a lot of potential master's and doctoral students, and let's be honest, grad students are pricks a lot of the time, okay? Not all of them, but I'm going to spin that back. In certain of the social sciences, there is a high degree, a combination of know-it-allism combined with imperiousness and an inability to be aware of the fact that you need to treat the people that make the place go with dignity and respect. The people who deal with grad students, bless their hearts, I love them. Sincerely bless their hearts, thank God. But you got to pay attention to this stuff. The little unwritten rules. I remember I was with my dissertation. I came to defend it. I was on my postdoc at Tulane. So I'm postdoc without a doc, right?
Okay.
And literally
Was this the Freeport McMoran
Environmental Policy Fellowship, yeah. Literally in a 10-day period, I am going to go to Athens, defend my dissertation, submit the files, drive back to New Orleans, close on our house, and move in.
I'm exhausted just listening to that sentence.
Yeah. Well, we got it done.
Well, you didn't really have a choice, did you?
No, I didn't have a choice, no.
It's funny how those, that's grad school in a nutshell. You if you're like me, the historian's pitfall is research. You can use your research to procrastinate.
Yeah.
And you get to that point where like, oh, I'm going to have to finish this dissertation if I want to take that job in the fall.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, so be it. And your fingers do the thinking sometimes. And
Well, the thing is,
done.
I'll be honest with you, when it came to the staff, I was not that prick grad student. But one thing that Chuck did that I probably took a little bit too much to heart as a grad student was he said, Keith, he said, remember, your competition's not these other grad students here, not even the other grad students elsewhere. Your competition's the assistant professors because you're trying to get their job. So you need to ask yourself, are you doing a better job than the people we've hired?
Oh, wow.
And so I took that to heart and leaned in. And
Is that why you went from assistant to full professor in 7 years?
Well, I mean, it was more like 10 because, I was 9 because I got my doctorate in 93 and I made full in 03.
Okay.
But in 7 years at OU, because I was at Tulane for 4 years.
Yeah, that's where that name
So, I was.
It's like I've read that number somewhere.
Yeah, but I was at OU for 4 years, initially in a postdoctoral fellowship and then in a research faculty line. It was a soft-funded line. The money came in part from the Freeport-McMoran Endowment that Larry Regan's held the chair, the endowed chair on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then part of the funding was we had a big Department of Energy grant to do environmental risk evaluation work at weapons production facilities for Department of Energy. So I was in charge of the risk perception writing team at Savannah River site.
I was going to say, Department of Energy weapons, that has to be nuclear weapons.
Yes, yeah. So we were, so my job was to evaluate the perception of environmental justice, a report on the perception of environmental justice at SRS. So this is in particular the K reactor and the tritium trigger production. And
I've interviewed Tom Clements.
There you go. Yeah. Blinky the three-eyed fish and all that. Yeah. So
we have Tom Clements' papers at the Russell Library.
That's awesome.
So my guess is there's probably some of your reports in there, or
what
have you about the Savannah River site.
Yeah. So the thing is, though, Tulane, it was hard. I was 26 when I took the postdoc.
Uh-huh.
And I was newly married, and you're getting started, man. You're not making any money. And
you're living in New Orleans, so what
it was literally the only job I could get. The thing is, though, I remember when Regan's called me up and offered me the postdoc because he had just left Georgia to go to Tulane, and Larry and I, we wrote 2 books together. Also, we've had a rocky relationship. It's okay though. Both of his sons were my undergrads at OU, and I adore his wife. But we, and mind you, I'm not going to elaborate on it, but my experience is not unique.
Say no more.
There are plenty of people that will work with me for decades, and I feel good about that. But he called me up, and I was at the APSA meeting in 1992 in Chicago at the Palmer House.
Mm-hmm.
And I got this call. I was like, man, I've been interviewing, but I wasn't feeling good about the job market still. And the truth is, I go through phases of mania followed by crashes to normal, basically bipolar. And you're
very common in academic circles.
And so you're fighting depression. It's like, okay, I can go to an AAU branded university on a postdoc and get my act together and maybe make my way to a research university on faculty, right? And the truth is, I wanted to be at a public institution, in a big institution in a small state with good sports. Okay.
You wanted to be Chuck Bullock.
Yeah, and the thing is, I wanted to be in a state also where, where really the pro sports weren't that important, but Georgia fit the bill back then also.
Still true.
Yes, yeah, it's how many banners have the Hawks hung? But I was thinking Kentucky, Nebraska, Oklahoma, someplace like that, right? Bama, Mississippi. I've interviewed at both those institutions for admin positions, but never really held out an attraction to it. Ole Miss, there's a romance to it in theory, right? But Fran Tarkenton said once that nowhere on the earth does the grass grow quite as green or as sweet as between the hedges in Athens, Georgia. He was right, and it's more than just the hedges. There's something There's nothing quite like it in the world. But but yeah, I go downstairs to the Palmer House in Chicago as we time travel around my life. I walk into the bar down there, the Oyster Bar, the old Oyster Bar in the Palmer House. And I go up to the bar to get a drink, and there's this fellow standing there being gregarious. He's a Yankee. And he says, "What's going on?" I said, "I just got my first academic job." "Well, congratulations. Let me buy you a drink, young man." Buys me a Boilermaker. It's Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was there as the Pi Sigma Alpha speaker. He had just given the Pi Sigma Alpha speech, come down and get a drink. Pat Moynihan bought me a Boilermaker to celebrate my first job. I mean, this is the man who created the new standard for public architecture in the Kennedy administration, the man who created much of the scholarship that both critiques and defends the welfare state. Amazing U.S. Senator, right?
That's right.
It's like, what could be more Irish than Pat Moynihan buying me a drink?
Very much.
Yes.
100%.
Yeah. So, and it's keep rolling here, but anyhow.
Yeah.
No, so I go to Tulane, and my thinking is, okay, I need to try and create a resume to get a research institution to notice me, because I'm an Americanist in the early 1990s. We're a dime a dozen, right? And I made the acquaintance of a guy named Gary Copeland at University of Oklahoma. And the chair you're sitting is actually Gary's retirement chair. He didn't want it, so he gave it to me.
Okay.
Yeah, so his name was on the back of it. Yeah, yeah. So that's my Gary Copeland endowed chair. But they had a couple of openings up there, and of course I knew about the Carl Albert Center already, which is a wonderful institution, but also OU. It kind of fit the bill, right? And so I came up and interviewed for the job in November of '95, and I'd also interviewed at the LBJ school.
Okay.
They had an environmental policy gig they wanted to fill, but they didn't know what they wanted. They had a very popular professor who died, and they wanted everyone to be her. And in my interview, my Freeport-McMoran money became controversial with the grad students, with some of them. But here's what was neat about that interview is there were 2 grad students on the search committee.
2?
Yeah,
Oh,
and they've always had strong graduate student participation in LBJ. And as I'm sitting meeting just with the grad students in a head-to-head meeting, which actually went really well, the principal grad student woman, she sits down and looks at me, and we're talking. She says, "So you came from UGA?" I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I'm from Atlanta, too." I said, "Yeah." I said, "I was looking at your profile. I see you went to Spelman." And she said, "Yeah, I did." And I said, "I had a friend at Spelman who I used to share an office with." She said, "Who?" I said, "Pete Wheelhire." She said, "Oh, yeah, we used to call Pete our triple affirmative action hire. He was white, male, and a Republican." It was Stacey Abrams.
No.
I met Stacey Abrams as a grad student at LBJ.
Really?
Yeah. And she was impressive. So everything you see now, she has always had that presence, that clarity. She impressed me that day. I remember that. And so when she came creeping back up, in a box, like, I've met that woman, right?
Right.
I keep, Bullock and I, we did a case with Ted Cruz once. I won't get into that, but no, we.
Is that when he was solicitor?
Solicitor, yeah. So that was the Tom DeLay gerrymander, yeah.
Oh, and that would be the fleeing Texas state legislators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still remember when they went on the lam. I got a call from a lawyer in Texas. Said, "Gaddie, you're up in Oklahoma." I said, "Yeah." He said, "So, we've got lawmakers that have taken flight up there." I said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "So here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a legislative bench warrant in place to use extradition to get them down." I was like, "Okay." And I hung up and I hopped on the phone and I called up Drew Edmondson, the Attorney General of Oklahoma. And because I know Drew, and I was like, "Drew, it's Keith. Oklahoma's about this big, right?"
Okay.
And he said, "Yeah, what's up?" I said, "I just had a conversation with a lawyer from the Attorney General's office at Texas. They say they want to use a legislative warrant to extradite all those House members that are down there down in Ardmore." He said, "Yeah, we've looked at. I appreciate the call on that. We were about to look into that, and here's what we think: is we think our extradition order only covers judicial bench warrants and not legislative warrants. So, the state of Texas can kindly go fuck itself."
Oh.
I was like, I said, well, Drew, do you want to hear from me as events warrant? And he said, absolutely. I was like, okay. But but yeah, that's how I got to OU. Is I wrote my way out of there. I did a book in an edited volume, and I think I had 11 peer-reviewed articles when I finished up at Tulane, which for political science is a good run. I had 6 articles come out in 95, 96. So I kind of exploded into the market that year. But man, I just wanted a job. I had an 18-month-old son. I just wanted to raise my kids, and Norman seemed like a nice, dull, boring place to go raise a kid. It's probably one of the most, at the time, it was probably one of the most unexciting college towns you'd ever been to. It's changed a good bit, but I'm interviewing 7 months after the Murrah bombing. It's the depths of the oil bust. The ruins of the building had just been brought down when I flew in to interview. And that state was marked deeply for a decade by that bust. But I told Kim when I interviewed, I got back to the airport, and I called her up, and she said, I was at Love Field. And I was in Houston, I was at Hobby. And she said, well, how was the interview? I said, well, honey, I think it went well, and I think they're going to offer me the job. And I said, the campus looks kind of careworn. You can see the impact of the oil bust. A third of the faculty are checked out. A third of them are fresh and new, but a third of them are really solid. I said, here's the main thing, though. David Boren just became president of the university. He's friends with Bob and Sam, and I think something great might happen. Because I knew Bob Graham in Florida, and I never knew Sam Nunn, but made his acquaintance. Always had respect for him. But Governor Graham's wife Adele, I took classes with her at FSU. She was auditing classes when he was getting ready to run for the Senate, and I said something great might happen, and I said if not, I can write my way out of here in 3 years. So I went in on a short clock. 3 years later, Georgia State offered me an associate professor position because Audrey Haynes was leaving to take a position at UGA that Chuck had tried to get me to apply for and couldn't get me in the door for the interview. I have attempted to get a job 3 times back at UGA. That was the first time, but Audrey, that was a great hire for them. They weren't looking for a master teacher, but they got one. And she and I were in grad school together. We did our masters together. I love her, I really do. And so looked at the Georgia State gig and decided to stay at OU. They did something nice. And then, 3 years later, I interviewed for the Blair Chair at University of Arkansas. And that was going to be offered to me, and then that got caught up in some politics that got a dean fired. That was fascinating. Dave Chappelle, the historian, was there at the time. And Dave's at OU now. Dave's a drinking buddy. Dave knows that story. It's fascinating. He testified at the trial over the litigation of that dean to try and, it's a hot mess of stuff. There were all sorts of Title IX issues and other things floating around, evidently. I may not be remembering that right, so forgive me if I'm wrong. But Chappelle was the good guy in the midst of all this, and that's Dave, right? He's a good guy. And so I interviewed there, and I interviewed at Texas A&M at the Bush School. And then I was about to go up for full professor a couple of years later at OU, and interviewed to be department head at Memphis and department head at Ole Miss on the same trip. And ended up getting a retention out of OU to stay, and they put me up for full. At the same time, Chuck had called me. They were trying to make a senior hire at UGA, and he got me on the interview list of 4. And this, by now, it's SPIA.
Yeah.
And then I got knocked off the interview list at the college level because I was deemed too divisive.
Too divisive?
They were trying to fuck with Chuck, is my impression. Forgive the language, I'm sorry. But yeah, it's, Chuck Mullick has an exacting and demanding standard. And that sometimes costs him with some people inside the department. But out in the broader university, it's commanded him nothing but respect and given him nothing but more and more power at that institution. It's rare that you see a man who's never been in administration who walks across a campus like he owns it as humbly as Chuck Bullock. I bet you Jerry Moorhead would give Chuck whatever he wanted because he knows that Chuck will be looking out for the interests of UGA. And that's the next lesson about being at an institution as a senior member is faculty at places like UGA and Oklahoma and Arkansas and LSU and Ole Miss, they really matter. You belong to that state. You have an obligation to give back to that state. That service matters. It's very important.
Well, it's the land grant mandate that we have.
Yeah, and it's OU wasn't even a land grant, but we still felt that drive, and you lean into that. You make the most of that. It means that you have an obligation to be a true ambassador, not just for the university to the state, but for the state itself. And that's just good citizenship, right? And so that's why I ended up at that point. By 2005, I decided I was just going to stay at OU.
Okay.
And then and we're in the middle of the litigation stuff, so I did the litigation stuff for 12 or 13 years, and had some good cases and some bad cases, and there was money. But when I got asked to move into it, I became editor of SSQ in 2010. And my predecessor had had the journal for 18 years, so I'm in year 13 as we sit here talking.
Okay.
And I'm getting ready to re-up for one more term, and then that'll be it. I became a department chairman. I didn't want to be a chair. I've never had a desire for institutional leadership. But what's fun about that job is you really do get to serve other people. And when you've got resources to work with, you can make good things happen. And other people have done that for me, like Ron Peters and Greg Russell. And so I kind of, felt when I was asked by the faculty to do the job, I decided to do it. And then I had literally not even, and mind you, Ash, when I talk about this stuff, I'm really surprised that I've gotten to do what I get to do in life. No, I really am. I'm just talking to you as a friend. I'm really surprised I get to do all this, and that people show up and ask me to do the things that they do, because I don't see it, right? But it really is a privilege to do those things. And literally, I had no sooner had I hadn't even started as chair, and I had a call about interviewing to be a dean at SMU.
Okay.
And I pursued. I wasn't ready for the interview. I wasn't qualified for the job. But I remember I got the call. I was at UGA giving a talk at SPIA in the spring of 14. I was out there in the spring of 14 giving a talk.
Okay.
And I get this call from this woman named Ann Dees, who is with a major search firm. She'd been president of Hendrix College at one point, and she'd been at Tulane.
Conway, Arkansas.
The city of colleges. Yeah. And we talked at some length, and she kept coming back to me in search pools over the years, and it's and then a couple of years later, I'm interviewing at SPIA, then I was a finalist to be dean at FSU, so both my alma maters have called. And with FSU, I probably would have taken it if they'd offered it. But by the same token, I'm really glad I didn't, because I've watched what's happened to Florida higher education. And I would be miserable there right now as a chair. Deaning a college of social sciences in that environment sounds like hell. A couple of provost gigs have come up. Last time I went on the market for administration was deanship at Alabama for their honors college. And I got to tell you, if you don't know the SEC, you'd think every SEC school is the same. University of Alabama has completely reinvented their campus. They bulldozed it from one end to the other. It's so thoroughly dominated by its Greek system as to be almost obnoxious. And I am a Greek. I work for my national. But every time I've set foot on a different Southern university to interview for an administrative job, I remember how special Georgia is. Because UGA has never lost its sense of history and identity. It runs deep. UGA, the Franklin College and the University of Georgia, is a very, very deep institution in the state of Georgia. probably deeper than most universities. You know, I don't know if University of Alabama gets to be University of Alabama without the football, right? Ole Miss has a quality to it that's distinctly Mississippi. I'd say the only other place in the South where the flagship matters the way UGA does to Georgia is LSU. And it's a near thing. It's a very near thing. Because LSU was made great by Huey Long. It was always good. Everybody forgets William Tecumseh Sherman was superintendent of LSU before the Civil War. Yeah. So it's yeah. So he knew what he was looking for when he came south. But at UGA, there's something incredibly special about the campus, the institution, the names. I mean, to me, the most fascinating thing about UGA is Phi Kappa and Demosthenian. To have not one but two great debate societies on your campus, physically housed in opposition to each other, in buildings with different architectural traditions that compete at the time. I will write an article on those buildings at some point. And to have the deep ties that they have to the state, the fact that the subscriptions that built Phi Kappa Hall were sold by Alexander Stevens is, you know, these, no story at UGA tells simply, and it always becomes personal. It's always personal. The story when I was writing my trivia book on Georgia football years ago, I did an entire section dedicated to Dean Tate. Because it doesn't matter how high you build that stadium, it'll always be in the shadow of the Tate Center, you know. Dean Tate loomed large over 2 generations, 2 full generations of college students at UGA. And he did the best job he could with whatever he confronted, including the most violent episode in the history of the university. People may not have looked at his solution as being dignified, but it was the closest you were going to come to a profiling courage that night that would leave everybody alive. Dean Tate prevented a lynching, in my opinion. And that needs to be revered and remembered, right? But you know, you're asking about UGA at the time earlier in this. I just remember things like whenever the snow and ice would come, the kids sledding down Russell Hill on the trays. Right? You know, it's...
Yeah, when the snow and ice come in Athens, and it hasn't for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm from the north. I remember how to drive in snow and ice. But sometimes I forget that we don't own a snow plow. Yeah.
And it's risible the way people act on this stuff. If they can get going fast, they think they can stop fast too.
Nope.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. Physics, she's strange that way.
When you hit the ice, find the snow.
Yeah. Yeah.
You may not think there's friction there, but there's a whole lot more friction there than on the ice.
Yeah. So, no, but, you know, and like I said, I know I'm just rambling at you now. But,
well, I mean, you've been at Oklahoma. You've been at TCU for a little bit.
Yeah.
But what... And you had a few changes. You went in journalism and architecture at Oklahoma.
Yeah.
What persuaded you to leave that big state school flagship institution for a private liberal arts college in Texas?
Well, you know, I mean, if I'm being honest, and honesty's good, right?
Yeah.
When I moved into admin at OU, I didn't want to do it. And what happened is David Borum was still president. And he kept elevating me in 2 things, because they called me the Energizer Bunny of campus, that I would just, Keith's busy, give him one more thing to do and he'll get it done, right? And so there was Res Colleges, there was the Intelligence Center, which was a federal grant. I'm not going to elaborate on that. That was a grant from the Defense Intelligence Agency. So I have the rare privilege of having a letter signed by Michael Flynn, which someday I'll sell on the Treason Network. But, you know, when Boren started this residential college project, they offered it up and I jumped in. And I was still in political science at the time, but I was kind of restless. I hadn't always liked the directions political science discipline was headed in. I feel like the discipline's marching down a trail that resembles economics in some bad ways. A little bit too enamored with arguing about estimators, not spending enough time asking, is the question interesting? spending too much time on the data and not enough time on the story, if we loop back to our earlier discussions. So what happened is when I interviewed at FSU, my dean, Kelly Danfus, who's now the president of Texas State, Kelly told me that I needed to go talk to Boren because I'm doing all this other work. I was like, "You're the dean. You go talk to David Boren. That's your job. You're the dean. You do that. Send an ask dean. It's just don't ask me to." He's like, "No, Boren likes you," and he says, and so I had to move heaven and earth to get on his schedule. And David was in my faculty. He was one of my professors, right?
Okay.
Tremendous personality, tremendous man, deeply, deeply shielded in some ways. You always get the David Boren show in some ways. But I went to see him, and I said, and he had just come from a regents meeting that was not pleasant. Former Governor Keating had been put on the board, and Frank and David have never gotten along particularly well. And I'm supposed to have a half hour for a meeting. He walks in, takes his jacket off, sits down, and I just look at him and I go, "David, how are you?" And he exhales. The next 30 minutes is him telling me about the regents meeting. And I'm leaving in 3 days on a job interview. And I told him what was going on. He just kind of slumped a bit. And he's like, "Keith, I wish I had a college to give you. Arts and sciences someday maybe, honors, but got leadership in all those, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I know." We sat there for a minute. It's late afternoon. And I said, "David, what if I told you the job I'd like to do? Let's see if we can't make that happen." And I told him, I said, "I want to be moved to a VP level," which I was at that point, would become. And I said, "I want to do strategy." I said, "You need somebody up here to do master in strategic planning and to try and figure out what comes after you." I said, "It's all locked in your head. We need to get it down on paper because," I said, "I know you're going to retire in the next 3 years." He was a little stunned because no one ever said that to him, even though we knew it was true, right? And he was ousted 18 months later. But and I'd already been working on strategic projects for him anyway, mainly related to housing. And he said, "Okay, what do you imagine?" And I said, "Well, here's the salary I want." He said, "Well, I got that." And I was going, "Shit, I should have asked for more." Right? And then he said, "Okay, what about title?" Title? And I said, "Well, this is the title." He said, "Oh, we can do that." And I said, "Also, I want to move my line over to the J school." I said, "I don't want to be chairman of political science anymore. I'm tired." I said, "The journalists are after me to come teach campaign journalism for them." And there was a guy over there named John Schmelzer, who actually has a house here in Fort Worth. He won the Pulitzer Prize at the Chicago Tribune. Oh. And a guy named Mike Betcher, who was the first reporter Ted Turner hired at CNN. Okay. "You need to get with Mike and get an interview incident. I'll get you his cell number. It's a 404.
There you go.
Yeah. But Mike has he has a Peabody and a bunch of Emmys. He was one of the first correspondents ever embedded in Afghanistan. But they wanted me to start doing work with their students. And so I moved my line over there just to do something different. I was tired of making lawyers. I wanted to make some journalists. Journalists are important, right? And so that's in 17. And so I get into all this stuff. And so suddenly I'm doing a bridge semester as department chair. I'm keeping the intelligence center running. I've come to work for the president, but the executive VP, who's a good friend, said, "Keith, there's no way we've got 31 vice presidents at this university. If we ask for one more, the regents are going to blow their gasket. We can give you everything except the title." I'm like, "The title is the only fucking thing that matters, because this changes my marketability if I try and leave." Yeah. So I have to come up with a title. So I become the Executive Faculty Fellow of the University. That was the title in the region. Keith Gaddie is the Executive Faculty Fellow of the University of Oklahoma. That was my exact full title. God, you think I've been, made, Baron of a minor province somewhere or some damn thing. I've got this res college off on the corner of campus. I'm teaching what I want to. And about this point in time, for several years I've been writing on public space and really kind of, Jocelyn and I were finishing the Supreme Court book. We hadn't even imagined the Georgia Courthouse project yet, right? But, starting to think in this direction, right? Think about this kind of thing. And then what happens is, in my retention, I had to write my own retention deal. I navigated the paperwork to keep me at OU. No one was sure who I worked for. Okay. Which the counsel for the university, Neil Galahali, said, Gaddie, he said, there are two people nobody knows who they work for, me and you.
Just throw your name on the organizational chart.
I never even appeared on the webpage, but I had this title. And everybody who had power at the institution knew to give me a call, right? And we had a provost who had been an undergrad of mine, brilliant young classicist, and Harvard trained, OU undergrad. But he had my 6 on this, right? And so I got my paperwork navigated. So I've got this letter that gives me control of my line. I become a department of one. So if I can come to a deal with the dean that I want to change colleges, I can do it. And no one can stop it. The provost can't veto it. It was just, if me and a dean could come to a deal, I had become the queen on the chessboard. I could go anywhere I wanted to. And it was about this point in time that Hans Butzer approached me, the dean of architecture at OU. Hans designed the Oklahoma City bombing memorial.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yep.
He's a serious public architect. Thomas Jefferson Award winner. Wonderful man. Wonderful man. His dad was a professor at UT, okay, and also at Chicago. But Hans approached me. He's like, I want you to affiliate with our faculty. And then after Boren got ousted and Jim Gallagher became president, Jim fired most of the vice presidents, and I was one of the last men standing. I'm going to tell you this. This is about faculty life, okay? Mm-hmm. And I've told these stories in public, so I don't mind telling. I knew I was up at Harvard at an executive training institute when Jim came on board, and he used to start showing up in my dining hall at Headington College, and we kind of got acquainted. And at this point, I realized, oh, I'm something rare. I'm a goofball with tenure. And I've got a president here who comes from industry. We got to get him used to faculty. Oh, I leaned into that shit. And I found common ground with him. I found good common ground with him. But he fired nearly every friend I had in the executive suite, okay? Close personal friends, next door neighbor kind of shit. The truth is, I still have survivor's guilt from that, in a way. It was like watching people get killed, okay? And I'd be getting a call. Did you hear what happened? Yeah, I heard Nick got fired. No, me too, somebody else. So then I went to the woodshed for 4 months, and I was completely sidelined, persona non grata. But we had to do something about our Tulsa campus. And so the dean of the law school, who had previously been a vice president of the university but had been demoted by this president, he and I are tasked by the provost to figure out, and the president to figure out Tulsa. So what had happened is the provost and the senior associate provost had gone to President Gallagher and said, look, Gaddie, you're wasting Gaddie as an asset. There's nobody like him who understands data and how to apply it practically to a problem. And I know, coming from me, what should you believe, right? But this is what he said: is you look at what he's done. Look at what he's done corporate. Look what he's done litigation. He's exactly the kind of fuzzy thinker you want on this kind of thing. So me and the law dean go to work on this. Go to work on Tulsa, and I won't get into the details of it, but we imagine several models and come back and prove that what the president wants is unrealistic. Then come January, in the midst of making this run, I take a month off and I go to Center College to teach because I need to go back to Kentucky and wrap my head around what the hell I'm doing. And this is January of 19. So I'm at Center for 3.5 weeks. And a major racial controversy breaks loose at OU. And a fellow UGA alumna who was a dean there at the time and had just been fired as dean of her college. So I went to grad school in political science. She makes a public spectacle at a town hall where the president's being taken to task over racial issues. And I'm watching all this because my wife Kim is there streaming it to me. I'm driving from Danville back to Norman. I leave early in the morning. I'm watching this as we go along. I get home, and I realize, oh man, we've got a mess. We've got a crisis. And as I walked in the door, I looked at Kim. I gave her a kiss. I sat down and said, I'll be right with you. And I wrote an email to the president, and I said, sir, basically, this is a shitstorm. We need a crisis consultant. We need a crisis PR consultant. I know 3 people. Here are their names. And then I hit send. And I looked at Kim and I said, you remember that deal we had where I get to sacrifice 25% of my income in order to do the right thing? I just sent that email. I'm going up to Torricino to get a drink. And I walked in, I ordered a Boilermaker, I sat down, I drank, and then my phone pings, and it's the president writing back saying, Keith, this is a good idea. Get in touch with Marcom in the morning. I've copied them on this. Let's see what we can do. Jim was ousted 3 months later by the board. And the dean of law is elevated to become interim president and then permanent president, which is the way it should have been. He had been David Boren's counsel on the Select Intelligence Committee in D.C. Okay, long ramble. This gets to the funny part, in a way. David Boren's always been he was always very much about having people in positions that he personally trusted and had personal connections to. And I'd be in meetings with him before I'd elevated, and we'd be talking about projects or whatever. And he'd get talking to me. And we'd talk, and we'd get into a story, and we'd start talking about Washington or someone we knew in common. We've got a table full of people held hostage for 40 minutes, right? And then his assistant would come and get him. And I asked my running partner, because she was head of development for arts and sciences, I said, why does he do that? Because she knows him and his wife very well. And she said, Keith, he thinks you were there. I said, what? He says, he thinks you work for Sam Nunn on the Hill. I said, I barely know Sam Nunn. She said, that doesn't matter. David Boren can look in a mirror, tell himself a lie 3 times, and it becomes true. And he thinks you were in Washington when he was there. He thinks you worked on the Hill. He associates you with Sam and Bob and with Wendell Ford. And he's convinced of that. So I said, what do I do? She said, you enjoy it. You enjoy it. But still, the man, he was amazing to work for as a president because there was always imagination, always an idea. But he also took things very personally. When we published 3 Governors Controversy with UGA Press, I sent him a copy.
Sure.
Because Sam's father is involved in this thing, right?
That's right.
And I run into him in the faculty club. He's there with
Mayor of Perry, Georgia.
Yep. But I run into him and Molly in the faculty club at his usual table. And he chat. And all of a sudden he stops, he goes, slaps, he goes, Keith, I finished reading your book. Molly, Keith wrote another book. It's about Herman. You remember Herman? He had a hollow leg. And then he starts telling the story about Herman.
For a long time, anyway.
Yeah. So I was telling the story about Herman and the overcoat.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And a half hour later, it's a Hermanathon. But it was a delight to work for him because you never knew what was going to happen. You never knew who was going to be on campus. You never knew if Desmond Tutu was going to show up or whatever, or Margaret Thatcher. It was a golden era for that university. So something special happened, and I got to be part of it. And then I watched a successor try and destroy it. And then I watched OU evolving in ways. I'd moved to architecture. I became associate dean of architecture. But I noticed with OU that the board had been transforming, and politics in Oklahoma were evolving in a way that makes me worry, talking to you in 2023 about the future of public higher education in Oklahoma. I think OU will be okay. But I realized that we had not advanced a single internal candidate to a deanship or a provost position or a major vice presidency outside of the associate vice presidents for research. And I didn't know if I had ambitions or not, but I knew my ambitions would not be satisfied at OU. And that caused a lot of examination, and I started getting calls again. And then you ask why I left.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I needed something fresh, and I was tired of public higher ed, at least in Oklahoma. And when this place called me, TCU, they called my friend Jim Rudelsberger. I've known Jim for 30 years. And he had reached out, and he's like, Keith, we've got this endowed chair we need to fill. Can you think of anybody who might be good for the job? And I said, well, yeah, Jim, how about me? He was like, what? I said, yeah, how about me? And so they called back up, and They had talked about the scope of the chair and what they could do, and I was like, I don't know. And then they came back again, and they came back a third time. They said, here's what we can do. Why don't you come to campus? And I said, for that deal, if you all decide you want me, I said, I'll tell you right now, if that's the deal and you decide you want me, I like what I see, I will come to TCU. I will join the faculty. I will take that chair. And they got me here in April of 22. And I got to campus, and I went over to the Hyatt over here near campus. And I put on my shoes. It was an afternoon about 78, 80 degrees. So it was a cool afternoon in Texas.
That's right. That's
almost
reasonable.
Oh, I mean, I was surprised I didn't see more parkas on campus. Right?
Get out the puffy coats.
Yes, exactly. So I took about a 4-mile run around campus. And I was looking at the students. I was looking at the campus. I was like, man, this is a nice place. And the other thing is, Ash, I grew up Disciples of Christ. Okay?
Right.
So I grew up in the Stone Campbell movement. I knew the background behind the institution. But I'd also made a list in my head that if I ever wanted to go back to faculty, there were exactly 5 schools I wanted to be on faculty. And 3 of them I'd already taught at. I would go back to Tulane, I'd go back to UGA, or I'd go to Center. Mm-hmm. And the other 2 were TCU and Vandy. And each of these schools fit a particular profile of institution and geography that were important to me. But also every one of them has something in common about the culture. There's something special in the water here. There's something special in the water in Athens. There's something special in the water in Danville. And knowing that, I knew I could come here and catch lightning in a bottle one more time. And I knew I just wanted to be a professor. Not just, I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to teach sharp, interesting young people at an institution where, there was a little bit more flex in the job. A lot of what's going on in public higher ed right now, there are a lot of things we need to do that are very important to address historic abuses and problems. But we're making the job needlessly over-bureaucratized and cumbersome. And it's exhausting sometimes. It's exhausting to be at a public university. And I needed something fresh, and this job allows me to work here and keep a home in Oklahoma. It keeps my family intact and keeps it close. Kim feels like she's building something out up at OU, and she's at a college that's growing, which is good. But the thing is, though, the substantive question, why did I go to journalism? I wanted to teach reporters. I wanted to work with those people. I needed to learn something new. Political science had gotten stale on me. Architecture, fascinating. My research was headed in that direction. Architects are fascinating people. They're wonderful to work for. They're wonderful to serve. I probably could have stayed there and taught forever and been okay. But I learned a lot there, and now I can bring it back into this space, and I get to create exactly my job, doing my thing my way. And in defining what does that mean, it means I get to have a personal, strong working relationship with a small number of students, mm-hmm. and build those relationships to last, because that's the one thing I take pride in my career, is that I've got people who I've known 30 years who I've met in the classroom who are part of our friend group. And I keep bringing this back to Chuck. The thing I learned from him is the power of relationship and how you sustain that and you cultivate that. And the one thing I'll miss, having never made it back to UGA, is I would have loved nothing more than to have stepped out there as the Dean of SPIA and know every lawmaker by name and every former lawmaker by name, and be able to walk into some little town and get to know them. Mm. And how I know I would have enjoyed it, and this will be the punchline, and we'll stop for the moment because we need to get some lunch.
Yes, we do.
Is, as I went around Georgia for 3.5 years visiting courthouses and meeting people, a lot of times people would respond to an inquiry, but a lot of times we had to cold call. There were 3 things that always gave me credibility when I walked in the door to visit with people. One was, I used to work for Georgia Athletics.
Uh-huh.
That's okay. Second was, went to UGA. But the most common one that worked was, I worked with Chuck Bullock. And I can remember he went out with me in the field a few times. And we'd go walk into some courthouse, and some 35-year service probate judge would see us walk up. Dr. Bullock, we're so happy here. We appreciate everything you do for the state. We love seeing you on TV. We love what you do with the university. We are so thankful we have you here. And I got to have that experience in Oklahoma. And now I want to see what I can do with Texas. That's because I won't get to come back to Athens. Because Louis Grizzard was right, though. Because if I ever do get home to Georgia, I will nail my feet to the ground. But yeah, that's the long rambling.
So yeah, if we take a step back, from the specifics of your own work, how would you describe Southern politics to an alien race who just dropped onto the face of the earth from Neptune or Mars?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Well, first of all, them being aliens, they would understand they're different. And a Southerner will always want to make sure that you know that if you're not from the South, you're different as well. So we're going to start off from a good baseline, right? To understand the South, you have to understand the Anglo-colonization of North America, and you have to understand really economics and the motives of human beings. Because if you look at a lot of the foundational development of New England, the upper South, the upper colonial states, the upper American colonies, including Canada, it's largely an exercise in conscience, right?
Okay.
Because you've got Baptists and Anabaptists and Calvinists, Puritans of various sorts trying to get away from the hegemony of the Church of England, right? And so they've come to this place that's, in terms of climate, fairly similar to where they've come from in England,
Sure.
right? And therefore the architecture translates well, the lifestyle translates well. It's really just kind of a wilderness version of Midland England more than anything. And the motives are about transplanting community and having control of the moral space, right? Self-governance at a distance. You come to the South. The motive in settling the South is like the motive of so many places that the English went to in the 17th century and 18th century. It's about economics, it's about resources, right? It's about the exploitation of those resources. And in the South, once they discover there's not gold, even though gold keeps coming up, right? You don't have the Cherokee Purchase in Georgia without
right.
gold. It becomes about resources, right? It becomes about agriculture. And what you see being replicated is the creation of the same kind of economy in general that you see being tried out in Ireland with plantation, and that you see in India, South Africa, right? A variety of more warmer climates that are not suited necessarily to lay English culture, right? But the entrepreneurs will come and try. And then this is where you also get the distinct, stark development break in the British Empire, which is you've got the one part of the British Empire that prospers with slavery and wants to expand on slavery. They don't really do it anywhere else, right? Now, of course, to give the South half a break, slavery was practiced in Africa and out of Africa, and a slave trade existed from Africa for centuries before the Atlantic slave trade came along. And roughly the same number of Africans were sold into bondage from Africa into the Middle East and into Central Asia as were sold into the Americas. Okay? We lose track of that in our history. But still, they persist longer. But it takes innovation to make it happen. So there's this, in the South, fundamentally, it's always been driven by economic enterprise. We want to say it's something else. We talk about the Old South, but that Old South we talk about that existed at the time of the Civil War was actually a frontier society that was in many areas is only 20 or 30 years old. It was all fairly recent, right? And that frontier movement, I think to understand the South, you have to understand that it was always an economic work, a work in progress, a work of people trying to leverage land and labor at the lowest possible cost to get the highest yield, and it grew up around monocropping, right? Once cotton becomes highly economical, right? And this is around 1790, 1800. You see this explosion of cotton growth in South Carolina and Georgia, right? It actually drives this frontier mindset because we're constantly wearing out the land and constantly moving the settlement line and the cotton growth line. And there are different ports of entry for people. It's always been entrepreneurship in some form or fashion. So we look at Georgia specifically. The Georgia that's settled between 1733 and 1810, it's driven largely by land grants to veterans, the Revolutionary War, right? Or people who are relocating and buying in, speculators and entrepreneurs. But the structure of the incentives to buy are so incredibly generous. It doesn't take a lot of cash, even at the time, to set yourself up with, under the rules, 600, 1,200, 1,800 acres, right? And so you end up creating, out of whole cloth and thin air, this gentry. And what flows into it is something actually is probably, you see this also happen in the American West during the gold booms. You see it following the development of the train line. You see it in Las Vegas, which is, you have an explosion of wealth, which is accompanied by an intrusion of the perception of what constitutes culture, right? And so what you see coming in the wake of the wealth that comes into Georgia, and I'll use Georgia as a vehicle for this, is you see the desire of those with money to spend money on the trappings of elitism, right? So we have academies, right? We have schools. We have opera. We have theater. We have dance. We have a social circuit that has ties to and rivals Philadelphia, right? And so there's this effort to grab a hold of the imprimatur of the ancientness of North American Anglo culture. And that's the thing about the South, is it wants to be older and more prosperous and more dignified than what it was. And because it was permissible to start with nothing and end up with everything, you didn't want to institute too powerful a caste system between the hill country whites and the rest of the state, even though they were clearly separated. And because you're relying upon the cheapest of labor available, people who you've bought, you're able to create a culture where there is no white working class. And that's part of the challenge with the South, is the South's always had competing tensions between its white upper class and its white working class, which was largely in the hill country. And part of that is reinforced by the patterns of the Anglos who settle there, the whites who settle there, the Huguenot French, the Scots Irish, whatever, because people gravitated to their places. But the South is really, we talk about the myth of the Old South. The South is just a frontier, and it's not that old.
How does that then...
And I didn't answer your question.
No. But how does that then inform Southern politics in the post-Civil War 20th century?
Well, of course, the Civil War helps define that, right? Because the war is fought for the economic benefit of the planter class. Okay, but the thing we have to remember about men in the frontier is men in the frontier like to fight. They went off and they fought in Mexico, right? They went off and they fought in Texas twice. It's they like to fight, and given the opportunity to fight something distant and to fight for a culture of honor, they would do so. But in the process, you got what you often get in the United States. I'm sorry if I end up sounding like Howard Zinn, but you end up with a poor man's fight for a rich man's war, right? And that's the thing for the South, is the South is informed by martial tradition, right? It's informed by speculation in particular. It is firmly invested in a set of traditional values that are mainly designed to keep power structures in place. Mm-hmm. And the thing with after the Civil War is, in throwing off Reconstruction, those property owners in the Deep South, in the Black Belt, needed the political assistance of the yeomen in the hills to succeed. And they needed a political rhetoric to break that and to ensure that populism couldn't take hold as a biracial political force. And that's how you end up with Jim Crow. You end up with the creation of the concept of white. The concept of white doesn't really exist before the Civil War, right? So you create this concept of white, and you put into place a series of very simple concepts and terms designed to activate men to the advantage of those with wealth, to the disadvantage of those who have nothing, especially if they're black, right? Because you still need, until the 19-teens, an inexpensive labor pool, right? You know, as you get post-boll weevil, you get mechanization. Don't need the labor pool anymore, right? And once you don't have that labor pool, you're happy to let this population migrate, and you let it go, but you don't want to let it have political power.
So to control the politics, you get what VOK calls, the four pillars of Southern politics. You've already mentioned one, Jim Crow.
Yep.
What else do we have? Malapportionment.
Yeah, malapportionment.
One-party rule.
One-party rule.
Disfranchisement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what you do is you wrap it in two different seemingly competing rhetorical devices. One of those rhetorical devices is Henry W. Grady's New South, right? That we are one nation after all. We want Yankee dollars. We want railroads and manufacturing. Look at our prosperous new cities. Oh, look, we too are building parks and parkways and buildings that look like the City Beautiful movement, right? We want Atlanta to be the regional capital of the United States.
Cotton States Exposition.
Exactly. Yeah. It will look like the Crystal Palace, right? Yeah. And so you're leaning into that space. And the other one is the lost cause narrative, which is related but not the same. And it starts with Jefferson Davis's autobiography of the government of the Confederacy not that long after the war. He was one of the first great biographers of the lost cause. And, the lost cause takes hold in terms of a narrative of what the war was really about. And so you get the phrase, the War of the Northern Aggression, that comes to the table. And this was really about, it's about tariffs and trade and monetary policy, all of which is informed by the monocropping agricultural economy of the South, which depends upon slavery to be profitable. So, it just keeps making its way back to that thing. So you have to fight your way through all of this chafe to get back to the heart of the reason why the division occurs.
Right.
But the thing is, it builds an institutional legacy. The United Daughters of the Confederacy grows up out of this. And suddenly they're throwing up statues everywhere, right? And you create this narrative. And that narrative makes its way. That narrative exists from the dawn of mass media entertainment. From the very beginning. And it's not just in Birth of a Nation, right? You repeatedly find the foundations of American Western film in movies throughout the World War I era that glorify the role of America Firsters and the Klan in defending against anti-American agents. And this has particular appeal in the South because the idea of red organization of farm labor, and of course we have the STFU, right? The Southern Tenant Farmers Union, right? You've got efforts to organize in this place, and you have to have anti-red activity. You have to have anti-red rhetoric, and you have to have national government activity come from the Bureau of Investigation, among others, to push back against this, for fear that you could actually have an organized reconstruction of the South if you can get the black vote organized, or otherwise empower it.
Right.
And now we're back to the old fears about about slave revolts and all that stuff, and you build around this mythology, but then what we do culturally is we build a romance around this, right? When we romanticize the problem, it's possible to ignore the problem. And this is where you get the moonlight and magnolias of the South, right?
And on the other hand, you have the economic report that the South is the nation's #1 economic problem, coming out in 1938.
And then you got Government All coming in right behind this with American Dilemma. And this sets up V.O. Key.
Right.
Because, University of Alabama gets this grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, $40,000 whole dollars, which is about $1.4 million in contemporary money. This is serious bucks, right? And Key doesn't want to do this project, but it goes all the way to the White House. Harry Truman basically calls him and says, "You're going to do this job," right? This, we have lurched along for decades because we didn't need to look at it. Until we started having Americans from up north vacationing down south. So Florida suddenly comes to the table, and you open up the South to the eyeballs of the nation, and then TV takes over from there. We finally affect change in the face of violence that had always been with us, but somehow we thought it was new and episodic. So back to your question of what do you tell an alien? What you do is you say there's a tradition in human history of the effort to control and exploit labor for the purpose of consolidating capital. It can often work in the short term. It may even work for a number of years, but ultimately it creates a challenge because human beings have an inherent tendency towards freedom. And the South does something that doesn't happen anywhere else in the U.S. It creates a perfect contradiction of arguing for freedom and liberty on the backs of denying it to people. And that somehow you get this Southern absurdism, that somehow a thing doesn't really mean what it means. And there's the but quality. You remember in a previous interview we had talked about sort of the unwritten rule book of the university. That unwritten rule book of understanding the Constitution, which is, we've got these things here, but not really. We have. You've got right to a speedy trial, but not really. You got a right to counsel, not really. And that's the peculiar dilemma of the South. That somebody could look at you with a straight face and say, we are a free people in a free country and we're defending the rights of men, including those who we enslave. And it's funny because that's why I started studying the South. I found it peculiar that I had grandparents who were Democrats, relatively liberal Democrats, who voted for George Wallace. And they were segregationists. Yet they were Democrats. And in the 1970s, it was hard to reconcile how you could have one political party that contained how you could have a political party that was integrated, pro-union, urban, and also rural, segregated, anti-union, right? One that was pro-peace, one that was pro-military, all in one umbrella. And they used this bizarre coalition based upon a certain degree of economic liberalism and rent-seeking to hold it together for 60 years. How do you do this thing?
Right.
How do you do this thing? How do you reconcile? So to define the South is you have to accept the fact that there are going to be facially obnoxious contradictions between rhetoric and reality. And it will come at you and no one will bat an eye.
You got to, you brought up the point of, in the words of the late great Alec Lamus, the Night and Day Coalition. V.O. Key, C. Van Woodward, to an extent, their students, Alexander Hurd, and others, they predicted a sorting along class lines.
Yeah.
The coalition of the haves, the coalition of the have-nots, those with money, the means, upwardly mobile, well-to-do, would sort along national lines into the Republican Party, and the coalition of the have-nots, the economically depressed, would sort into the Democratic Party, the party of the working man.
It didn't work out, did it?
Exactly. Why did that not happen after the New Deal, after World War II in the South?
Well, you think about it, you had some coincident disruptions, one of which is through legal action and activism, Jim Crow starting to fall. And no one had ever really thought about this in that context, right? That you would have returning GIs, right, who would fall on both sides of the line. So even as much as you may have the GIs that are overthrowing the machine in Richmond County, Georgia, for example, over in Augusta, or my personal favorite, the Battle of Athens, Tennessee, which is just an amazing story. Actually has been made into a movie. You also have the Colombians. And there's always been this small subset of Americans who find the Nazis fascinating. And then if you go back and you read C. Van Woodward, you see why, which is we actually exported a lot of this crap, and we somehow conveniently whitewash that out of our own history, that we're complicit in helping to create Nazi Germany through practice, that we're complicit in creating the South African and Rhodesian segregated republics through practice, that we exported all this stuff. Why doesn't it happen, though? Honestly, I think a thing we have to remember about America in general is when we come home from war, we're tired, and we want to turn to other things. And if we don't have to see it, we don't worry about it. We didn't have to see it, so we didn't worry about it. But you still also got ongoing migration. You got movement about. People headed west, people headed north, people headed to the cities. The problem with this labor migration is it requires a degree of coordination that's never been regionally possible. And the one organization that might have been able to do it was completely destroyed in 1919, and that's the International Workers of the World, right? They tried to make a second run through the STFU, but it got destroyed by the same anti-red strategies and tactics that were used against the International Workers of the World. The mechanism's just not there, right? And with regard to the civil rights movement itself, it was focused more on the vote. And the characteristic of that type of combined joint labor movement would require not just coordinated action on black and white, it also required the unions to do something they weren't prepared to do, which is integrate. And it wasn't just integration by race. In many cities, you had different ethnic groups with control over different union jobs, right? So, the Italians are in coal mining, the Scots and the Irish have got the plumbers. You can't get past the fact that the institutions that you needed to have facilitate this kind of movement were not willing to embrace the idea. They weren't willing to embrace the idea. Maybe United Auto Workers,
the Machiavellian genius of the Philadelphia Plan of Nixon.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
On its face, a very progressive program.
Yeah.
In hoping for an inspired backlash.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing we have to remember about power. Remember what FDR said, in politics, nothing just happens. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way, right? For the South, the other thing with the South in this respect is the South is only going to move on the basis of certain first principle stimuli. And what no one saw that was studying the South in mid-century, and almost no one saw it coming even into the 1970s, was the role of evangelical Christianity. Falwell's a Democrat until 1980, right? Supports Carter for president in 76 and says Jimmy Carter lied to us, right? But yeah, this know what happened is God. None of this happens in the long run because God becomes politically activated after nearly 2 centuries of the Baptists staying out of politics, right? And even on top of that, they could have had the chance to come in. But guys like Wally Criswell, the Pope of the Baptist Church from over here at First Dallas, keeps them out of politics. Here's how confused things are in the late 60s. The Southern Baptist Convention is trying to integrate, and they're doing it under the leadership of one of the most segregationist ministers in the history of the Southern Baptist Convention, W.A. Criswell. This church, which is also the foundation of the pro-life movement in the United States, Criswell praises the Roe decision when it happens. So what happened, ultimately what happens is we've got this sorting going on, this effort to push back against aggressive integrationist policy, which is driving evangelicals into the conservative political movement. They're getting activated throughout the 70s, and then by the mid-80s, they're already there. You just need to give them candidates. And that's where it started. It started with the school boards, and then to the counties and the state legislative contests. It made its way up to Congress very quickly. It took less than 15 years to take what Atwater was imagining in the mid-70s and put it in active form between 1986 and 1995.
So why weren't the Democrats in Georgia, especially in Georgia, less so in other southern states, able to keep their coalition together and maintain their hold on power for so long?
I think, this will sound funny to say, but I think that one thing that Tom Murphy appreciated was what Tip O'Neill said, which is all politics is local. The legislative districts were so numerous and sufficiently small that you could maintain local representation in areas, even after one person, one vote. Because of local legislation and the rules of the Georgia legislature, the nature of the distributive function of state government was highly beneficial in nearly every legislative district, every county in the state. But principal among this is the fact that in Georgia, more so than any state in the Union, state government is hyper-local, which meant that any implementation of any state policy wasn't going to come from a distant agency in Atlanta. It was local, and the discretion over implementation resided down there in the counties. And you look at it, the history of the state is entirely about the county being the state. It's a source of political and social identity. Government is organized around that principle. Legislature used to be organized around that principle. It is simply the case that I think Georgians actually had more trust in their government in general, white Georgians, because they controlled it locally. And I think there is something about the character and nature of the lawmakers they elected, that these were an exceptional class of courthouse town lawyers that we often sent off to Atlanta. And legislature wasn't in session long enough to do too much damage to anybody. But also the state did things well that mattered. County extension, tremendous. Roads, highways. Georgia, irrespective of who was in power, has always tended to the things that matter most, which is getting people and product to market and making sure that people feel like they've got agency and control over their local government. And also a healthy dose of corruption in some areas, if we're being honest, okay? So there's always been enough local political tradition. But, the other thing with Georgia, though, is if you were to go back and look at the work of Peter Narduli, political scientist up at Illinois, he's retired now. He did an examination using factor analysis of cluster loadings in the movement of national vote over the entire United States at a county and sub-state regional level. The one part of the United States and the one part of the South that never, ever had a significant realigning event impacted from the beginning of the Union until the 1980s is Georgia outside of the hill country. Okay, so if you go anywhere from 50 miles north of the fall line down, these counties were almost completely untouched by national political waves. It was just Democratic Party down the line all the time, decade after decade for 175 years. Because they're immune to the forces. And then when realignment does come to Georgia and takes hold, the politicians are both politically conservative enough and politically practical enough to simply make the jump, right? And they take their voters with them. But the thing is, I don't know if you can underestimate the power of Sonny Perdue in all this. Okay, because when Sonny Perdue did something that no Republican had ever thought about doing before. He took his game to the ground in Middle Georgia. In the last 4 weeks of that 2002 campaign against Roy Barnes, everybody thought Roy was going to win, right? And Sonny Perdue just disappeared. Other than that King Rat commercial that they were running, there is no evidence that Sonny Perdue exists because he's down there on the ground campaigning like he's still a county commissioner, right? It's like he's still campaigning his beat, and he's working it on the ground. And he taps into one sentiment left that used to serve the Talmadges so well, which is you don't want some elite Atlanta fancy boy telling you what to do. Like with the flag, right? Or your schools. So, that principle of hyperlocalization gets violated by Roy Barnes, his administration. Actually, do you know Mark Hershkovitz?
I know the name.
You need to do an interview with Mark. Mark was Sonny's counsel for the campaign in '98 and then counsel to the governor. You make good interviews. He's another one of Chuck's kids. Okay. Actually, you know what would be fun? Put him and Gabe Sterling in a room together. They were in college at the same time.
Gabe Sterling, there's a name that everybody knows now.
Oh, yeah. It's sort of funny when all that was going on. People come and say, what do you know about those Gabe Sterling guys? Like, I've known him since he was 19 years old. What would you like to know? He's one of the good guys. Yeah. But no, that's, I think that's, where a lot of this, Ash, I haven't thought about this in years.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of digging deep here. But, the thing that I wonder about Georgia is, V.O. Key talked about the hell of a guy, right? In local politics, there's still a lot of hell of a guys left. They might be Republicans now, but their daddies were Democrats, their granddaddies were Democrats. The county commissioner over in Washington, Georgia, over in Wilkes County, his father was sheriff over there forever. His brother's sheriff now. They've got they trade livestock. Okay, so they've got a big setup over there. You walk in that building, you wouldn't know if this man was a Democrat or a Republican or or an American social Mennonite. I don't know what, but because the thing I observed in traveling around Georgia, even at this late date, is the folks that are in government actually do care about governing. When I would talk to county clerks, I asked the question, what was the biggest surprise in taking this job? The number one response I got from all these Republican clerks, these new Republican clerks, was, I had no idea that we had the drug problem that we have in this county, and we need to do something for these people. And that to me is, that informs a lot, which is these folks did come to govern. They want to govern effectively. They want their communities to be better, right? They want people to be better. And that's something that I don't think national political rhetoric can connect with. I think Georgia being so local in its governance, it has to connect with these broad-based national problems at a highly local level.
Well, what do you think? When I first started studying Georgia politics in 2008, 2009, 2010, that was when the Republican Party really firmly established one-party control.
Yeah.
Why do you think now, as we sit here in 2023, that Georgia has become so competitive, at least at the top of the ticket? Maybe a bit slower down ballot. But what do you think accounts for that?
There's a lot going on there. And here's the thing, demographics may not be destiny, but demographics certainly drive destiny. And you cannot have a state that is quickly evolving. You can't control a state if you're entirely reliant on Anglo-white votes. And that's the only segment of the population that's not growing, right? And you've had a series of policy choices you've made over time. You have rhetoric, both in national politics and among certain state political leaders, that makes it difficult to make the bridge to Hispanics as they emerge as voters. But actually, for me in particular, it's Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese American votes, Gwinnett County, for example. And of course the black vote. I mean, we've been listening to Republicans talk about how blacks should have a natural affinity to the GOP, even as they're now running out to defend Confederate monuments, right? It's just, you can't find the bridge and the hook to get there in the long run, because the power of LBJ and the Great Society and the role of the left in attempting to knock down the barriers to full citizenship for blacks were powerful. Republicans had a century to get there and never got as close, right? But, in Georgia, it's the demographics piece is part of it. The second thing is, when you have a supermajority party, one of the tendencies in supermajority party systems is that both the ambitious and the corrupt will make their way to the majority party and make their way into politics, right? So you may not end up with necessarily the best politicians being there to sustain your brand, right? Because they're going to be about their own opportunities, their own ambitions. And let's look at Georgia politics and where we've seen problematic personalities. They used to be on the Democratic Party side, now they're on the Republican side, right? And that makes sense, because if you got more seats and you got more power, all the problem children are going to gravitate to you in politics. That's the second part. And third thing is that just the model of life and where the growth is in the state is in the areas where you've got local democratic governance and where you have people take advantage of the benefits of sophisticated modern policy and sophisticated modern economics. And the areas that are hanging on for the GOP are in decline. They tend to have non-diversified economies or non-diversified agricultural bases, right? And it's just there's not a lot to build on there, right? But Georgia is a state that strains under a seemingly relentless growth of Metro Atlanta. I mean, Metro Atlanta has leaped into Alabama now, I think, right?
It's pretty close.
And it's going to converge on, it's going to make its way up to Chattooga County and converge with Chattanooga soon enough. You're going to have this amazing trapezoid. It's going to reach down to Macon, right? It'll reach as far, it already reaches, almost to Greene County, Georgia. It's just, it obliterates history.
Well, and you've got the huge economic developments in Morgan, Morgan County, Walton County.
And these are tied to the global economy. These are tied, and they're tied to manufacturing.
Bryan County.
And we used to say in Oklahoma that the number one predictor that a district could go from Democratic to Republican is that you started building 4-lane roads. Okay, and I think that kind of applies here to what happened in Georgia, right? That as you remember, the old sign said "trees grow jobs." Yeah, and then it became "highways grow Republicans." Well, the problem is it also brought a sophistication that's at odds with the national GOP.
Well, I think that's a nice segue into the question of what role does Donald Trump play and the Trump administration, or more broadly, just the Trump phenomenon that has consumed American politics since 2015.
Well, you know, it's funny. If Trump had failed, I thought somebody should have written a documentary titled Searching for George Wallace, because that is Donald Trump, right? Trump is an honest-to-God populist of the old school, of the old Southern school. He is a Talmadgite, okay? He is a Wallace populist. Alfalfa Bill Murray in Oklahoma would have been comfortable with him, because the tools and the rhetoric is the same, right? And he plays a character. He plays the character of what a poor man thinks a billionaire would be like. But he also plays, the big man, the strong man. And he does it in... Donald Trump's rhetoric is a verbal version of cartoonish violence. And it's no surprise that this man...
Professional wrestling.
Professional wrestling is exactly where I was going. So watching Donald Trump giving noogies to Vince McMahon as if these were actual blows, anybody believing this is real. And that's the thing, is you wonder if we shouldn't have a test, a 3-part test to vote that goes, 1, is wrestling real or fake? Well, it's real. Okay, you can't vote. Is wrestling real or fake? It's fake. Okay. Do you care that it's fake? Not especially. Okay, you don't get to vote either. You know,
it's real, but it's choreographed.
Yeah, and so it's this. But the thing is, Shakespeare is populated with cartoonish characters and cartoonish violence from time to time, and rhetoric of this sort. It's part of the English language tradition, this stuff. Yeah, but Donald Trump activates... Okay, I'm gonna make this deadly serious for the moment. If we were to go back and look at a Section 2 voting rights case, okay, there are 3 principal prongs to bring in a voting rights case and redistricting. Okay, the Jingles criteria, right, which is, do you have racially polarized voting? Does it usually lead the candidate of choice of blacks to lose in an election? And is the population sufficiently geographically compact to constitute a majority of a district if so drawn? But beyond that, there's also this thing called the totality of circumstances test. One of the totality of circumstances tests that's highly prominent is the use of racially inflammatory appeals or rhetoric in politics. Donald Trump's rhetoric is on par with the rhetoric that we used to see in Georgia in the 1970s, was pointed to as evidence of totality of circumstances warranting a Section 2 remedy under Voting Rights Act. Okay. What made it so difficult is because Trump was national. It was everywhere. It was everywhere. And so it brought back to the table and re-legitimated a language and a rhetoric, not just of implicit racism, but also of political violence being normalized. Yeah. So this is Talmadge making an appeal in 1946, right, which leads to a lynching out in Walton County, horrible lynching, last major lynching event in Georgia. The thing is, though, in Georgia, what's fascinating is even as Trump has this appeal, Trump loses the state the second time out, right? Trump does not have the ability to cow the party establishment in the manner that he's done in so many other states. And I think it's because of one aspect of the development of the Republican Party in the 1980s and 1990s, when Johnny Isakson was sort of the uncrowned king of the state GOP, which was Republicans actually believed in good government and stood for good government, good reform, fair elections. And these were people of principle. These are people of principle. So, I look at the Secretary of State and, and I look at my friend. I look at my friend Gabe Sterling. I know Gabe's character and what he believes about good government, right? I know about his works in trying to implement a fair, effective, transparent voting system in Georgia. These are men of sufficient character and sufficient principle that they were going to stand up and say no, even if there were dire consequences, even if they were being confronted with violent threats. Because this is what a gentleman does. And that's the other part of the South that we have to get back to, is amidst all this talk of economics and, talk about sort of the Potemkin South. Behind all that veneer, there actually are people who believed in law and rule of law, right? Not law and order, rule of law, predictability, honesty, because in Georgia we have enough evidence of what it's like when you have corruption and you have a GOP that's deeply invested in not being corrupt. And I don't know if it was something systematic in the GOP or not. I know I've implied that. But the right individuals at the right time were in a place to prevent something from going far worse. Biden was still going to win that election. But they consistently stood up and defended representative democracy. Even as people like Speaker McCarthy attacked it, defended it, attacked it. Former Speaker McCarthy.
That's right.
And I think part of that may be deeply ingrained in, again, going back to the institutions. If you passed a bill in the Georgia legislature, you didn't want it overturned in the courts. Anybody ever talked to you about Denmark Groover?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Grooverized, right? You go to Denmark, have him look at your bill, make sure it was watertight. That way you could speak to your colleagues and say, this bill has been grooverized. We know this will stand up to legal challenge. Georgia is about doing your due diligence, right? You think about it, that's something very old, and there's a reason why we do our due diligence. Because in 1793, we got embarrassed like hell because of the Yazoo land swindle. You don't want to have that kind of embarrassment.
You had to burn that with God's cleansing fire.
Indeed, yes. But again, the point is, Atlanta, first and foremost, has always been a city run by its Chamber of Commerce.
The Atlanta way.
Yeah, and ever since 1868, Georgia has always been about economic development. Atlanta has always been a transportation hub. It was going to be a manufacturing hub. It was the perfect place for the potential for energy and industry in the Hill Country to meet ease of transportation in the middle part of the state, right? And this place, you have to have a predictable place to do business. You have to have a place that you want those Yankee dollars to be comfortable, right? Which means you can't have a bunch of political violence. Atlanta needs to be the city too busy to hate. After the early 20th century race riots in Atlanta, we create zoning in the city, in part to create segregation, but we do it in a very clever manner, right? By putting industrial and commercial zones into place to create buffers to prevent ethnic tension, right? Because it wasn't just black and white, but that's part of it, right? And you end up with an Atlanta that doesn't look like a lot of southern cities. You have a major Jewish district in the south side of Atlanta, for example. You're not going to find this in most of the Deep South. But I think there's something deep in the culture that just feeds through. The fact that higher education has always been rather expansive in Georgia, especially in Atlanta, has to matter on some level. But again, also, when you have significant control over local government, and you know the people that are running government, and you know it's not corrupt, you're probably going to have some trust in it. And maybe that may be part of it. And also, Georgia has enough experience with clowns to recognize Marjorie Taylor Greene for what she is. Go Dogs.
Well, that's usually the line I use when I end these interviews.
Yeah.
But I think that's an excellent way to end a very long, very in-depth, very thoughtful interview.
You're very kind.
Dr. Keith Gaddie, thank you so much for your time, your hospitality, your insights, your expertise. And on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, go Dogs.